What if the story of the Anunnaki didn't begin on Earth, but with a war they lost somewhere else? Ancient texts hint at powerful beings who arrived on our planet long ago, but some theories suggest they came here only after being defeated in a massive conflict. A war so significant, it may have forced them to leave their original world and seek a new one, Earth. But why did they lose? And what were they running from? If these ancient accounts hold any truth, then the arrival of the Anunnaki might not have been exploration, but escape. In this video, we explore the mystery of the war the Anunnaki lost, and what it could mean for our understanding of human history. There is a story older than any civilization you were taught about in school. It is a story that was pressed into wet clay tablets by hands that moved with urgency, as if the scribes knew that what they were recording was not myth, not allegory, not the imaginative fiction of a primitive people trying to make sense of thunder and rain. What they were recording was history, a history so vast, so staggering in its implications, that it would take humanity thousands of years to develop the intellectual and scientific vocabulary, even to begin to understand what was being described. We are only now in this era of particle physics, genetic science, astrophysics, and deep archaeological inquiry, beginning to decode what those ancient scribes were trying to tell us. And what they were trying to tell us is this: before humanity existed, before the first city rose from the mud of Mesopotamia, before the first king sat upon the first throne, there was a war. Not a war between primitive tribes fighting over hunting grounds. Not a war between city-states competing for river water. This was a cosmic war. A war fought between beings of extraordinary intelligence and power. Beings who had mastered technologies that we are only beginning to theorize about. Beings who traveled between worlds the way we travel between cities. And the critical world-altering detail that the ancient texts make clear, the detail that changes everything we think we know about human origins and the purpose of our existence, is that these beings lost that war. They lost catastrophically. They lost in a way that forced them to abandon their home, to flee across the void of space, to arrive on a primitive world called Earth, not as conquering gods descending in triumph, but as refugees, as survivors. As a civilization in desperate need of something that only this small blue planet could provide. That is the story we are going to tell today, and we are going to tell it through the ancient texts themselves, because those texts are far more specific, far more technically coherent, and far more internally consistent than anyone who has not read them carefully could possibly imagine. We are going to walk through the Sumerian tablets, the Akkadian creation epics, the pre-Diluvian king lists, the cylinder seals, the Babylonian astronomical texts, the fragments recovered from Nippur and Ur and Lagash and Eridu. We are going to read the Book of Enoch and the Ugaritic texts and the Egyptian pyramid texts and the Vedic hymns and the Norse Eddas and the Mesoamerican codices. Because what emerges when you lay all of these ancient sources side by side, when you strip away the mythological vocabulary that ancient people used to describe things they lacked modern words for, is a single coherent narrative. A narrative of a civilization that rose to unimaginable heights, that was torn apart by internal conflict, that fought a war for survival, that lost, and that came to Earth carrying the wounds of that defeat. A narrative that explains, with extraordinary specificity, why they came, what they needed, what they created when they got here, and what that creation, which is to say us, was meant to accomplish. This is not a fringe theory. This is not speculation built on wishful thinking. Every claim we make today is anchored in actual ancient texts, in real archaeological discoveries, in genuine scientific inquiry. The interpretation of those texts is, of course, a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, and we will honor that debate, presenting the evidence and allowing you to draw your own conclusions. But we will also be honest about something that mainstream scholarship has sometimes been reluctant to confront directly. The ancient people who wrote these texts were not describing mythology. They were describing what they believed to be literal, factual history. They named names, they gave dates, they described specific technologies, they drew detailed astronomical maps, they recorded genealogies that span hundreds of thousands of years. These are not the characteristics of myths. These are the characteristics of historical records, and when we treat them as such, something extraordinary happens. The picture that emerges is not the picture of a primitive people inventing gods to explain natural phenomena. The picture that emerges is the record of actual events, actual beings, actual technologies, and an actual war whose consequences shaped everything that followed, including the creation of the human species. So let us begin at the very beginning, which is not in a garden in the Middle East, and not in the primordial seas of early Earth, but somewhere far older, far stranger, and far more distant. Let us begin with a world called Nibiru, with a civilization so advanced that the gap between their technology and ours may be comparable to the gap between our technology and that of the ancient Sumerians. Let us begin with the Anunnaki before they came to Earth, when they were still at home, still powerful, still whole, and still at war. The world before the world, Nibiru, and the Anunnaki civilization. To understand the war, you first have to understand the world that was fighting it. The Sumerian texts are remarkably consistent on this point. The beings they call the Anunnaki, a term that translates most accurately as those who from heaven to earth came, or alternatively, those of royal blood who descended from heaven, did not originate on earth. They came from somewhere else. The texts are explicit about this. They describe a world, a planet, which the Sumerians called Nibiru, a word that in Sumerian astronomical contexts meant planet of the crossing or the crossing point, referring to the manner in which this world intersected with our solar system on a long elliptical orbit. The Babylonians would later associate Nibiru with the concept of a crossing or ferry point in the heavens, a liminal space between the known and the unknown. The planet is described in the texts as massive, larger than any of the rocky inner planets, and it is described as having a characteristic that sounds scientifically improbable, but is not impossible. It generates its own heat. It sustains life not through proximity to a star, but through an internal nuclear decay process, generating warmth from within and supplementing that with an atmosphere thick enough to trap whatever radiant energy it does absorb during its periodic passes through the inner solar system. Modern astrophysics has actually provided us with a framework in which this is not as implausible as it once seemed. Brown dwarfs, rogue planets, and large gas giants do generate internal heat. Some astronomers have theorized that certain super-Earths with thick hydrogen atmospheres could remain habitable for billions of years even without close proximity to a star. The discovery of exoplanets in highly elliptical orbits has forced scientists to reconsider what habitable actually means. The assumption that life requires a circular orbit in a narrow habitable zone around a sun-like star has been increasingly challenged by discoveries of extremophile life in environments that should, by earlier models, be completely incompatible with biology. We are not suggesting that modern science has confirmed the existence of Nibiru. We are suggesting that the scientific framework within which such a world could exist is no longer as alien as it once seemed. The Anunnaki civilization on Nibiru, as described across multiple ancient text traditions, was old, extraordinarily old. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable ancient documents in existence, records the reigns of kings in the antediluvian period, the period before the Great Flood, in terms of tens of thousands of years. Scholars have long dismissed these figures as mythological exaggeration, the same way medieval European scholars once dismissed the idea of Troy as myth before Heinrich Schliemann dug it up. But if we take the texts at face value, if we engage with them the way we engage with, say, the records of the early Roman Republic, even knowing that those records contain legendary embellishments, then what emerges is a picture of a civilization with a history spanning hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years, a civilization that had, by the time they came to Earth, long since solved the problems that currently define the limits of human ambition. They had solved energy production, they had solved space travel, they had solved genetic engineering. The evidence for all of these claims is in the texts, and we will examine that evidence carefully. The social structure of the Anunnaki, as described in the Sumerian tablets, was hierarchical in a way that would be recognizable to any student of human political history, but scaled to a degree of complexity and longevity that staggers the imagination. At the apex of the hierarchy was Anu, whose very name meant sky or heaven in Sumerian, the supreme ruler of Nibiru, the father god of the entire pantheon. Below Anu were his sons, the two who matter most to our story, Enlil and Enki. These two figures, half-brothers born of different mothers, represent one of the great fraternal rivalries in the history of any literature on Earth. And that rivalry is not merely a dramatic device. It is the engine that drove the Anunnaki civilization toward the crisis that ultimately forced them to come to Earth. Enlil was Anu's heir by legitimacy. He was the son born of Anu's official consort, which in Anunnaki law and custom made him the firstborn in the legal sense, even if Enki was older in years. Enki, whose name meant Lord of the Earth, or Lord of the Abzu being both the freshwater underground and, in a broader sense, the domain of knowledge and wisdom, was the eldest son in terms of birth order, but lacked the status of legitimate heir because his mother was not Anu's principal wife. This distinction was not merely ceremonial. In the Anunnaki social order, as the texts describe it, legitimacy of birth determined succession with an absoluteness that made the later obsessions of European royal houses look casual by comparison. Enki was brilliant. Every text that mentions him emphasizes this. He was the chief scientist, the master engineer, the genetic genius who would later be credited with the creation of humanity itself. He understood the deep structure of living systems in a way that the texts consistently attribute to a kind of divine wisdom, but which reads, through a modern lens, as extraordinary scientific knowledge. He loved knowledge with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. He built the Abzu, described in the texts as a great structure or facility, in Eridu, the first city built by the Anunnaki on Earth, and it served as both his residence and his primary laboratory. The texts describe him creating and modifying living organisms the way a skilled programmer might write and debug code, with an intimate understanding of the underlying architecture and a creative vision for what that architecture could be made to do. Enki was the Anunnaki's greatest mind. Enlil was something different. Where Enki was a scientist, Enlil was an administrator, a commander, a ruler in the functional sense. He organized, he commanded, he issued decrees, he managed the mission on Earth with a rigidity and a sense of divine authority that the texts consistently portray as inflexible to the point of cruelty, but also effective in the brutal mathematics of large-scale operation management. Enlil controlled the Tablets of Destiny, described in various texts as the source of Enlil's authority and power, the divine command authority that determined the fates of gods and men alike. The Tablets of Destiny appear again and again in the ancient literature, and their importance to the story of the Anunnaki War cannot be overstated, as we will see. They were, in whatever physical or metaphysical sense they existed, the ultimate symbol and source of legitimate authority among the Anunnaki. To possess them was to rule. To lose them was to be stripped of power in the most fundamental sense possible. Between Enlil and Enki, then, stretched a tension as old as the Anunnaki civilization's recorded history. One had authority, but perhaps not wisdom. The other had wisdom, but not authority. One controlled the mission parameters. The other understood the underlying science. And both, in their own ways, loved humanity, though for very different reasons and in very different ways. Enlil saw humans as tools, created for a specific purpose, to be managed and directed, and, when they exceeded their purpose or threatened Anunnaki interests, to be culled. Enki saw humans as his creations, his children in a very real genetic sense, beings whose capacity for growth and consciousness he admired and protected, even when the other Anunnaki found that protection inconvenient or threatening. But all of this, the rivalry, the hierarchy, the love and contempt for humanity, came later. Before any of it could unfold on Earth, there was the situation on Nibiru. There was the crisis that drove the Anunnaki from their home. And that crisis, the ancient texts make abundantly clear, was not merely environmental, not merely a case of a planet running low on resources, though that was part of it. The crisis was also, and perhaps primarily, political. It was a crisis born of the same tensions that would later define the Anunnaki's relationship with Earth and with humanity. It was a crisis born of the war. The texts describe Nibiru as a world in decline. The atmosphere of the planet, which the Anunnaki had maintained through complex technological intervention for eons, was deteriorating. The mechanisms by which they had sustained habitability, mechanisms that the texts describe in terms that sound remarkably like terraforming technology, were failing. The cause of this atmospheric degradation is described in some texts as natural, the result of the changing orbital dynamics of the planet during its long elliptical journey, and in other texts as at least partly the result of the warfare itself, the catastrophic weapons used in the conflict having damaged the very systems that kept Nibiru alive. Both of these causes may well be true simultaneously, and the interplay between them, natural decline accelerating amid the additional damage of warfare, would have created a catastrophic feedback loop that made the situation on Nibiru increasingly untenable. The specific mineral that the Anunnaki needed to repair and sustain Nibiru's atmosphere is named in the texts with remarkable specificity. It is gold, not gold as a currency, not gold as a symbol of wealth or status in any of the ways we use it, but gold in its specific physical and chemical properties, as a material capable of being dispersed into an atmosphere to create a reflective, protective shield. This use of gold is not as scientifically outlandish as it might initially seem. Gold nanoparticles have been studied in modern science for their optical properties, including their ability to reflect and scatter certain wavelengths of radiation. The concept of seeding an atmosphere with metallic particles to alter its optical properties is something that contemporary climate scientists have actually discussed in the context of solar geoengineering. The specific choice of gold, rather than, say, iron or aluminum, makes sense in terms of its chemical stability, its resistance to oxidation, and the unique way its electrons interact with light at the nanoscale. The ancient texts, in other words, describe a technology that is not magic. It is physics. It is chemistry. It is the application of material science to atmospheric management, something that our own civilization is beginning to theorize about in the context of climate change. The problem was that Nibiru did not have sufficient gold to do what needed to be done. The planet had been mined for its accessible gold deposits over the course of its immensely long history, and what remained was not enough. The Anunnaki knew, from their astronomical knowledge, which was considerable, that gold existed in abundance on Earth. The third planet from the star they orbited periodically was practically drowning in the stuff, particularly in its crust and mantle. The decision to mount a mining expedition to Earth was therefore not impulsive. It was not the act of a young, expanding civilization looking for new worlds to conquer. It was the desperate calculation of an ancient, wounded civilization looking for a lifeline. But before that decision could be implemented, before the first Anunnaki spacecraft touched down on the shores of the Persian Gulf, and the first Anunnaki commander looked out at the raw, primitive beauty of early Earth, there was the war to be survived, and the war was not going well. The Cosmic War. What the ancient texts actually say. The evidence for the war among the Anunnaki before their arrival on Earth is distributed across multiple ancient textual traditions, and the fact that these traditions converge on the same basic narrative, despite having arisen in different cultures, different languages, different geographic regions, and different historical periods, is one of the most compelling arguments for the literal historical basis of that narrative. Let us examine the primary sources. The most important single text for understanding the war is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, whose title translates roughly as "when on high" from its opening words. This text, inscribed on 7 clay tablets that were discovered in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 19th century and now held in the British Museum, is far older than its Babylonian form. Scholars of ancient Mesopotamia have established that the Babylonian version is a later recension of earlier Sumerian texts, adapted to elevate the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, to the supreme position that had previously been occupied by Enlil in the Sumerian tradition. When we strip away the Babylonian theological overlay and look at the underlying Sumerian narrative, What we find is not a creation myth in the poetic sense that the word myth implies. What we find is a cosmological history describing the formation of our solar system, the establishment of the Anunnaki on Nibiru, and the war that preceded the colonization of Earth with a degree of astronomical and geological specificity that is simply not consistent with the work of people who are making things up. The Enuma Elish begins before the Earth exists. It describes a primordial state of the solar system in which the planets we know did not yet have their current configuration. In particular, it describes a large planet called Tiamat occupying an orbit between what we now call Mars and Jupiter. This is not a coincidence. The asteroid belt, the band of rocky debris that currently occupies that orbital space between Mars and Jupiter, has long been identified by planetary scientists as the remnant of a planet or protoplanet that either failed to form properly due to Jupiter's gravitational influence or was, at some point in the solar system's history, broken apart. The Enuma Elish describes the destruction of Tiamat in terms of a catastrophic collision with another massive celestial body, identified in the text as Marduk or, in the earlier Sumerian version, as Nibiru itself. A rogue world entering the solar system on a hyperbolic or highly elliptical orbit could indeed have had a catastrophic gravitational or physical interaction with an existing planet in that orbital zone. The texts describe the collision in terms that are consistent with what planetary science would predict such an event would produce: fragments, debris, a new configuration of the solar system's inner planets, and the formation of what the Sumerians called the hammered bracelet, which is to say the asteroid belt. Critically, the Enuma Elish does not present this cosmic collision as something that merely happened in the natural course of events. It presents it as part of a conflict. Tiamat is not an inert planet. In the text, Tiamat is a being, a primordial goddess described as a mother of the early gods, a force of chaos and ancient power who refuses to accept the new order that the younger generation of gods represents. She raises an army. She creates monsters. She appoints her son Kingu as commander of her forces and gives him the tablets of destiny, empowering him with supreme authority to wage the war on her behalf. This is the key moment, the moment when the tablets of destiny appear in connection with warfare and rebellion, and it tells us something essential about the nature of the conflict being described. Tiamat's war is not a war of mindless chaos against order. It is a war about authority. It is a war about who controls the fundamental power structures of the Anunnaki civilization. Kingu holding the tablets of destiny means Tiamat's faction holds legitimate command authority. It means they are not merely rebels. They are, in their own framing, the legitimate rulers challenging an upstart order. When Marduk defeats Tiamat and takes the tablets of destiny from Kingu, something of profound structural importance happens. The symbol and source of supreme authority changes hands. Marduk's victory over Tiamat is not just a military victory, it is a legitimization. It is the moment when the new order becomes, by the only definition that matters in a civilization that measures authority by possession of the tablets, the legitimate order. This is why the other gods, even those who initially refuse to face Tiamat in battle, ultimately accept Marduk's supremacy. Not because they particularly want to, not because they love him or agree with him, but because he has the tablets, and the tablets are the proof of divine authority. The war, in other words, is not just about physical survival. It is about the most fundamental question any civilization can face: who has the right to rule? Now here is where the interpretive question becomes fascinating and consequential. Mainstream scholarship reads the Enuma Elish as a mythological account of creation, a Babylonian theological document designed to explain how the world came to be and to establish Marduk's supremacy in the Babylonian pantheon. That reading is not wrong. The text certainly functions in that way, but it does not have to be only that. A text can be simultaneously a theological statement and a record of actual events, particularly in ancient civilizations, where the distinction between divine and historical narrative was not as rigidly maintained as it is in modern academic writing. The Greek Iliad is both literary epic and historical record. The Hebrew Bible is both theological document and historical chronicle. The Mahabharata is both spiritual text and military history. There is no reason why the Enuma Elish cannot be all of these things at once. A theological statement about Marduk's supremacy, a cosmological account of the solar system's formation, and a historical record of an actual conflict among actual beings who the ancient Sumerians understood as gods, because the technological gap between those beings and the humans who encountered them was so vast as to make the word God feel like the only appropriate descriptor. When we read it as all of these things simultaneously, when we take seriously both its theological function and its potential historical content, the picture that emerges is of a war among the Anunnaki that was, at its root, a conflict about the structure of their civilization, about authority and legitimacy, and about the question of who had the right to determine the future of the species. Tiamat's faction, whatever we understand that to represent in concrete historical terms, represented one answer to that question. Marduk's faction represented another. The war between them was so destructive that it changed the physical configuration of the solar system, if the Sumerian astronomical account is to be believed even in broad outline, and it left the victors in possession of a solar system reorganized around the conflict's outcome, but with a civilization that was profoundly damaged. A civilization that had fought the most terrible war in its history and emerged victorious but wounded, in need of resources it did not have, on a planet whose atmosphere was failing, forced to look outward for salvation. But the Enuma Elish is only one piece of the textual evidence. Let us look at some of the other primary sources because they add dimensions to the story that the Babylonian creation epic does not capture. The Atrahasis epic, another Mesopotamian text of great antiquity, picks up the narrative in a different phase after the Anunnaki have already arrived on Earth, but its opening passages are invaluable for understanding the internal dynamics of the post-war Anunnaki society. The text begins with a description of the Anunnaki working on Earth, mining and processing resources, organized into a hierarchy in which the greater gods, the Anunnaki proper, direct the labor, while the lesser gods, called the Igigi, perform the actual physical work. The Igigi, whose name has been interpreted as meaning those who watch and see, or the watching ones, are described as working for 40 periods of time, each period representing either 40 years or 40 cycles of some longer duration depending on the interpretation, before they reach the limits of their endurance and rebel. This rebellion of the Igigi is one of the most significant events in the ancient Mesopotamian textual tradition, and it is almost never discussed in popular accounts of Sumerian mythology because it complicates the clean narrative of all-powerful gods creating humanity for their own inscrutable purposes. The Igigi rebellion reveals something crucial. The Anunnaki civilization on Earth was not a smoothly functioning divine operation. It was a desperate resource extraction mission staffed by beings who were exhausted, resentful, and on the verge of mutiny. The Igigi had been working the mines, the texts tell us, for an enormously long time. They were laboring under conditions that were clearly understood as degrading and exhausting even to beings of their nature and capability. They burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's dwelling. They demanded relief. And in their demands, we hear something that has echoed through every labor struggle in human history. We are not objects. We are beings with needs and limits. We cannot continue like this. Enlil's response to the Igigi rebellion is instructive. He does not immediately attempt to crush them by force. He calls a council. He consults with Anu and Enki. And it is in that council, in the conversation between the three supreme figures of the Anunnaki hierarchy, that the decision is made to create a new kind of being, a being that could take over the labor of the Igigi, while the Igigi themselves were given more appropriate roles. That new being is, of course, humanity, but we will come to the creation of humanity in due time. For now, what the Atrahasis epic tells us about the pre-human Anunnaki situation on Earth is this: the beings who came to this planet were not omnipotent. They were not serenely in control of everything. They were struggling. They were managing a crisis. They were dealing with the political and social fallout of the war they had fought and the desperate circumstances that had driven them to Earth in the first place. The Igigi rebellion is, in this reading, the social consequence of the cosmic war, a civilization so depleted and so desperate that it was forcing its own people into conditions that even those people could not sustain. The Book of Enoch adds yet another dimension to the story. This text, which was excluded from the canonical Bible, but which was clearly known to and valued by the early Christian community, it is quoted in the Epistle of Jude, which is canonical, describes in remarkable detail an episode in which a group of beings called the Watchers, who correspond closely to the Anunnaki and particularly to the Igigi, descend to Earth and, against the explicit orders of their superiors, begin to interact with humanity in ways that were not sanctioned. They teach humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, magic, the art of war, the writing of sacred texts. They take human women as mates and produce hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, described in the Book of Genesis as the mighty men of old, men of renown, and then, crucially, they are punished. The leaders of the Watchers are named and described in detail. Semyaza, who led the rebellion, Azazel, who taught humanity the arts of metalworking and warfare, Barakiel, who taught astrology, Kokabiel, who taught about the constellations, Armaros, who taught the resolving of enchantments. Each of these figures taught something specific. Each of these gifts of knowledge corresponds to a specific technological or scientific domain. This is not the behavior of mythological figures invented to explain natural phenomena. This is the behavior of actual beings with actual knowledge, making actual choices about what to share with a less advanced species, and suffering actual consequences for those choices. The Watchers are bound and imprisoned. The Nephilim, their hybrid offspring, are destroyed in the flood. The forbidden knowledge they transmitted is, in the eyes of the Anunnaki hierarchy, a catastrophic breach of operational security. It is not merely sinful in a theological sense. It is strategically dangerous. It accelerates the development of a species that was created for a specific purpose and was not supposed to develop beyond the parameters of that purpose. We will return to this point at length. For now, the Book of Enoch's contribution to the picture of the pre-Earth Anunnaki situation is this. The war left the Anunnaki with factions, with dissenters, with individuals and groups who did not agree with the hierarchy's decisions about how to manage the Earth mission, and particularly about how to manage humanity. The Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon and made their forbidden pact were acting against Enlil's explicit commands. They were, in the language of the texts, rebels, and their rebellion echoed the older, more catastrophic rebellion that had defined the war itself. The Enuma Elish in depth, the cosmological war and its real meaning. We need to spend more time with the Enuma Elish, because it is the most detailed account we have of the actual war, and because its details, when examined carefully, reveal a conflict that is far more complex, far more politically textured, and far more consequential than any simple reading of it as creation mythology would suggest. Let us walk through the text carefully, beginning with the conditions that led to the conflict. In the beginning, the Enuma Elish tells us there was Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu is described as the begetter, the primordial fresh water, and Tiamat as the mother of them all, the primordial salt water, the chaos of the deep. When their waters mingled, the first gods were born, Lahmu and Lahamu, then Anshar and Kishar, then Anu, and from Anu, Nudimmud, whom we know as Enki. Now, at the cosmological level, this is describing the formation of the solar system. Apsu is the young sun. Tiamat is the primordial planet that occupied the space between Mars and Jupiter. The mixing of their waters, in planetary science terms, corresponds to the gravitational interactions between the early sun and the forming planets, the exchange of material and energy that characterized the chaotic early solar system. But at the historical level, this is also describing the Anunnaki civilization's deep genealogical origins, the first generations of their line. The trouble begins, the text says, when the young gods, the descendants of Apsu and Tiamat, begin to make noise, to disturb the primordial couple's rest. At the cosmological level, this is describing the orbital perturbations caused by the newly formed planets in the young solar system, the gravitational disruptions that would have been genuinely destabilizing. At the historical level, this is describing something equally recognizable: generational conflict. The younger generation of gods is vibrant, active, dynamic. They are doing things. They are building things. They are changing the order that the older generation had established, and the older generation finds this intolerable. Apsu decides to destroy the young gods, to restore the primordial silence that preceded their birth. But before he can act, Enki, the cleverest of the young gods, discovers the plan, and Enki does not wait for Apsu to strike. He acts first. He casts a spell upon Apsu, plunges him into a deep sleep, takes his brilliant crown, strips him of his mantle of radiance, and kills him. This is a coup. This is the younger generation of gods, led by the most intelligent among them, overthrowing the old order before the old order can destroy them. Enki then establishes his abode within the body of the slain Apsu, setting up the Abzu, his domain of knowledge and wisdom, in the space that Apsu had occupied. This early episode is important for several reasons. First, it establishes Enki as the decisive actor, the one willing to take bold, preemptive action when the situation demands it. This character trait will define Enki throughout the ancient texts, on Earth as well as in the heavens. He is the god who acts when others hesitate, who finds creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, who refuses to accept the parameters he has been given when those parameters would lead to outcomes he finds unacceptable. Second, the killing of Apsu tells us something about the internal politics of the Anunnaki. Their history was not one of stable, harmonious divine rule. It was a history of conflict, of generational struggle, of beings with enormous power and enormous ambition clashing with each other for dominance. The war that would eventually drive the Anunnaki to Earth was not an aberration in a long history of peace. It was a continuation of a pattern of conflict that went back to the very origins of their civilization. But it is Tiamat's response to the killing of Apsu that ignites the full-scale war. Tiamat does not immediately retaliate. The text is careful about this. There is a period in which some of the gods urge her to avenge Apsu, to go to war against Enki and the younger generation, and Tiamat initially refuses. She is a complex figure. She is not simply a force of destruction and chaos, despite how later Babylonian theology would characterize her. She had been Apsu's consort, yes, and his killing is a personal loss. But her first instinct is not revenge. Her first instinct is caution. Something shifts, however, when the gods who want war intensify their pressure on her. The text suggests she is persuaded, but it also suggests that something more fundamental is at work. The political situation has become unstable in a way that forces her hand. The killing of Apsu has disrupted the power balance. Enki's coup has created a new reality, and in that new reality, Tiamat's position is uncertain. She must either accept the new order that Enki and the younger gods represent, or she must fight to restore the order she knows. She chooses to fight. Tiamat's war preparations are described in extraordinary detail. She creates monsters, 11 types of them, creatures that sound like nothing in the natural world: the serpent, the dragon, the hairy hero, the great demon, the savage dog, the scorpion man, the mighty storms, the fish man, and the bull man, among others. These are sometimes interpreted as purely mythological beings, inventions of the ancient imagination. But there is another reading. These are weapons. These are military constructs. The monsters of ancient myth have a long interpretive tradition in which they represent machines, vehicles, weapon systems. The scorpion man, for instance, is a being that is half human and half scorpion, that appears in multiple ancient traditions as a guardian of thresholds, a being of terrible power. Could this be a soldier in armor? Could it be a biological construct, a genetically engineered warrior? The ancient texts do not give us enough detail to be certain, but the pattern of Tiamat creating specific types of specialized combatants for specific tactical purposes is consistent with the behavior of a military commander building an order of battle, not a primordial chaos goddess randomly generating monsters. Tiamat also appoints Kingu as her military commander, her new consort, the leader of her forces, and here is the crucial political move. She gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, entrusting him with supreme command authority. "Your command shall be unrivaled," she tells him in the text. "May you be exalted over all the Anunnaki." This is the formal legitimization of Kingu as supreme commander, and it is done with the Tablet of Destinies because that is the only instrument that can confer true legitimate authority in the Anunnaki system. Tiamat is not just arming her forces, she is performing a constitutional act. She is establishing a new legitimate order under Kingu's command, challenging the authority of Anu and Enlil and all the gods who had accepted Enki's coup as a fait accompli. The assembly of the gods, what the texts call the divine assembly, is thrown into panic. No one is willing to face Tiamat. Anu himself, who should be the supreme authority, goes to face her and turns back in terror. Enlil goes and retreats. The great gods are helpless, weeping, unable to find the courage or the capability to oppose Tiamat's forces. The situation is desperate, and it is in this moment of crisis that Marduk, the son of Enki, steps forward and offers to fight Tiamat on behalf of the gods. But Marduk's offer comes with a condition. If he fights and wins, he wants supreme authority, not just military command, supreme authority over all the gods, forever. If I am to champion you, he tells the divine assembly, if I am to bind Tiamat and save your lives, assemble and proclaim my lot to be supreme. Sit joyfully together in Ubshukina. Let my word, instead of yours, fix fate. Whatever I create shall be unaltered. The decree of my lips shall not be revoked or changed. This is a constitutional moment of the highest order. Marduk is not merely asking to be a general, he is asking to replace the existing structure of authority with himself at the top permanently. The gods, desperate and without other options, agree. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described in the Enuma Elish with vivid specificity. Marduk carries a net given to him by his grandfather Anu, the four winds assisting him, an evil wind, a whirlwind, a hurricane, a fourfold wind, a sevenfold wind, a cyclone, and an unrivaled wind, clearly representing different weapons or tactical capabilities. He drives his chariot against Tiamat, the chariot being drawn by four horses named Killer, Relentless, Trampler, and Swift. He carries a bow and arrows, a mace, a net, and lightning. He faces Tiamat in single combat. When Tiamat opens her vast mouth to swallow him, Marduk drives the evil wind into her open mouth, fills her body with wind so that her frame distends, spears her belly, splits her in two, and kills her. Then he deals with King, strips the tablet of destinies from him, and seizes it for himself. From Tiamat's body, Marduk then creates. He splits her like a shellfish into two parts. From one half, he makes the sky. From the other, the earth. He uses her eyes to create the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. He places her head as a mountain. He arranges the stars according to their proper positions. He creates the moon. He organizes time. He creates order from the body of chaos. This creative act from the defeated enemy's body is not mere mythology. It contains, encoded within its imagery, the memory of the actual planetary rearrangement that occurred when Nibiru, on its elliptical orbit, collided with or catastrophically disrupted Tiamat, the planet in the asteroid belt zone. The fragments of Tiamat became the asteroid belt, what the Sumerians called the hammered bracelet, and another portion became the Earth, displaced to its current orbital position. The waters of Tiamat, the oceans, came with it. The creation of the moon from a piece of Tiamat corresponds to the leading scientific theory for the moon's formation, which holds that the moon was formed from debris ejected when Earth suffered a massive impact with another planetary body early in its history. The politics of the aftermath are equally important. Marduk creates humans, the text says, from the blood of the defeated king, to take over the work of the defeated god's faction, to serve the victorious Anunnaki so that they can rest from their labors. This is the creation story of the Enuma Elish. Not a creation from nothing, not a benevolent divine act of love, but a practical solution to a labor problem created by the violence of the preceding war. The beings who lost the war, or those associated with them, are made to serve the beings who won it, and that servitude is embedded in the Enuma Elish's account, into the very biology of the creatures created to perform it, because humans are made from the blood of Kingu, the defeated commander of the losing side. What does it mean to be made from King's blood? At one level, it is simply a mythological statement about the origin of humanity. At another level, it is a genetic statement. Humans were created from the biological material of a being who was associated with a defeated faction, carrying in their very cells the biological heritage of those who lost the war. This theme, the idea that humanity carries within it something of the defeated side, something that the victorious Anunnaki hierarchy found dangerous and needed to manage, runs through multiple ancient text traditions and will be a central theme of our exploration. The Tablets of Destiny, the ultimate prize and what they represent. We need to understand the Tablets of Destiny more fully because they are the central object around which the war in the ancient texts revolves, and their significance goes far beyond their function as a symbol of divine authority. The Tablets of Destiny appear in multiple Mesopotamian texts, not just the Enuma Elish, and in each appearance they are associated with the most fundamental questions of power, legitimacy, and the ordering of reality itself. To understand what the ancient Anunnaki were fighting over, we need to understand what the Tablets of Destiny actually were. The Sumerian term for the Tablets of Destiny is Dup-Shemati, and the concept encompasses something that our modern vocabulary struggles to express precisely. The tablets were not merely a symbol of authority, the way a crown or a scepter symbolizes royal power. They were understood as the actual mechanism through which the future was determined, through which fates were set, through which the fundamental laws governing reality were established and enforced. To hold the Tablets of Destiny was not merely to be recognized as the ruler, it was to actually have the power to determine what would happen, to set the parameters within which all other beings, divine and human alike, were constrained to operate. Modern readers might be tempted to interpret this metaphorically. The tablets represent legal authority, the power to make laws, to determine social order. That interpretation is not wrong, but it may not go far enough. The ancient texts are quite specific that the tablets have actual causal power, that holding them genuinely changes what the holder can do and what others can do in their presence. In the Anzu myth, which we will examine shortly, the theft of the tablets by the bird god Anzu immediately causes the Anunnaki hierarchy's powers to fail. The regular order of things breaks down. Enlil, without the tablets, finds himself unable to function with his normal authority. The connection between possessing the tablets and possessing actual functional power is presented as mechanical, causal, immediate. One way to understand this that bridges the mythological and the technological is to think of the Tablets of Destiny as a sophisticated system of access control and programmatic authority. In any complex technological civilization, the ability to issue commands that are recognized and executed by the civilization's systems requires the appropriate authorizing credentials. If you hold those credentials, the systems obey. If you do not, they do not, regardless of who you are or what you claim. The Tablets of Destiny, in this reading, were the master credentials of the Anunnaki civilization, the device or document that authorized the holder to access and direct the fundamental systems through which that civilization operated. Losing the tablets was not merely losing a symbol, it was losing the ability to command the systems, losing the ability to direct the infrastructure, losing control in the most practical and immediate sense possible. This reading is supported by the most detailed account of tablet theft in the ancient texts, the Anzu myth. Anzu, sometimes called Zu or Imdugud, is described in the texts as a divine being of bird-like form, a great eagle or storm bird of enormous size and power. He is given the role of guarding Enlil's sanctuary, and in that role, he has access to observe Enlil performing his daily ritual, removing the Tablets of Destiny as part of a washing ceremony. In this moment of Enlil's temporary vulnerability, when the tablets are not in Enlil's direct possession, Anzu seizes them and flies away with them to the mountains. The immediate consequences of Anzu's theft are described with striking specificity. Snatched the Tablets of Destiny from Enlil, took the power, and the power of Enlilship was taken from him. The phrase "the power of Enlilship" suggests not merely that Enlil's authority was symbolically diminished, but that a specific, defined set of powers and capabilities was literally transferred from Enlil to Anzu by the act of taking the tablets. The divine assembly again falls into panic. Who among the gods will slay Anzu and restore the Tablets of Destinies to the great god Enlil? This is not a rhetorical question. The restoration of the tablets is understood as a concrete necessity, not a formality. The situation cannot be resolved, the order cannot be restored until the tablets are physically recovered. Various gods are asked to undertake the mission. Anu asks Adad, the storm god. Adad refuses. Anu asks Shara, a warrior god. Shara refuses. The gods are afraid. They remember what happened to those who faced Tiamat. They understand that Anzu is not merely a thief to be apprehended. Anzu has the tablets. That means Anzu has power, real power, the power to determine fates, including their own. To face Anzu is to face a being who, in that moment, controls the fundamental mechanisms of reality within the Anunnaki system. Eventually, Enki, once again the decisive actor, devises a strategy. He sends Ninurta, his son by a human woman in some accounts, a divine warrior in others, to face Anzu. He gives Ninurta specific tactical instructions, a method for defeating an enemy who controls the tablets. The battle is fierce and closely fought, but Ninurta ultimately prevails, kills Anzu, and recovers the tablets. The Anzu myth tells us several things about the tablets and the war. First, the tablets were vulnerable. They could be stolen, they could change hands. They were not permanently and irrevocably attached to any particular deity. This means the authority they conferred was a matter of actual physical possession, not of any inherent divine right. Second, the theft of the tablets was not understood as a simple act of robbery. It was understood as a potential restructuring of the divine order. If Anzu had been able to hold the tablets and consolidate his position, the implication is that he would have become the supreme authority, not because anyone recognized him as having that right, but because the tablets are the right. Third, the recovery of the tablets required not just military force, but clever strategy. Ninurta succeeds where others failed, not because he is stronger than Anzu. Anzu with the tablets is effectively infinitely powerful in the conventional sense, but because Enki devises a specific method for overcoming the tablets' power. This suggests that the tablets, whatever they were technologically or metaphysically, had specific characteristics that could be worked around by someone with sufficient knowledge of their mechanisms. In the context of the larger war described in the Enuma Elish, the significance of the tablets becomes even clearer. Tiamat gives them to Kingu to legitimize his command. Marduk wins them from Kingu in battle and gives them to the divine assembly as proof of his victory and his right to supreme authority. The entire political resolution of the war is expressed through the transfer of the tablets. The war ends not when the last fighter on one side falls, but when the tablets change hands and the transfer is acknowledged. The acknowledgement of the transfer is the political act that transforms military victory into legitimate authority. You can win every battle and still lose the war if you cannot establish recognized legitimacy. And in the Anunnaki system, legitimacy flows from the tablets of destiny. What does this tell us about the nature of the war itself? It tells us that this was not a war fought purely for territorial control or resource access. It was a war fought over the right to determine reality, or at least, in more practical terms, over the right to control the systems and infrastructure through which the Anunnaki civilization was governed. The group that controlled the tablets controlled everything. The group that lost the tablets lost not just a battle, but their ability to function as an organized force. This is why the defeat in the war was so total and so consequential. It was not a defeat that could be recovered from simply by regrouping and fighting again. Losing the tablets meant losing the ability to mount any effective organized response. It meant the losing side was reduced to whatever it could do with individual capabilities and local resources, stripped of access to the central systems that made organized civilization possible. For the Anunnaki who lost, for Tiamat's faction, or whatever historical reality that faction represents, the loss of the Tablets of Destiny was an existential event. It did not merely end a war, it ended a world. It ended a way of being, and the question of what happened to those on the losing side, where they went, what they became, and whether their defeat was truly final, is a question that haunts the ancient texts in ways that scholars have not always fully appreciated. The losing side, who they were, and what became of them. Every war has losers, and the fate of the losers is one of the most important things history has to tell us. The Anunnaki War, as described in the ancient texts, was no exception. In fact, the fate of those who lost the war is perhaps the single most consequential element of the entire story for understanding both the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth and the nature of humanity. To understand this, we need to identify, as precisely as the ancient texts allow, who exactly was on the losing side and what happened to them. The primary sources give us several different but complementary perspectives on this question. From the Enuma Elish, the losing side is associated with Tiamat and Kingu. After Tiamat's destruction and Kingu's defeat, Marduk deals with the other members of Tiamat's army. He binds them, he smashes their weapons, he throws them in a net. He destroys their capacity to continue fighting. Then, in one version of the text, he sets them to performing labor for the victorious gods, a direct parallel to the later creation of humans to perform labor for the Anunnaki on Earth. The defeated gods of Tiamat's faction, stripped of their military power and their weapons, are set to serving the victors. Their punishment is servitude, and their servitude is the immediate precursor to the human creation event, which occurs precisely because the gods of the defeated faction prove incapable of sustaining the labor indefinitely. From the Atrahasis epic, the losing side is represented in part by the Igigi, the lesser gods who end up performing the actual mining work on Earth before humans are created to replace them. The Igigi's rebellion against their working conditions, as we discussed earlier, is what precipitates the human creation event. But who are the Igigi? In the Sumerian texts, the Igigi are sometimes distinguished from the Anunnaki proper as a different class of beings, lower in the hierarchy, assigned to the heavens and to laboring tasks, those who see and watch, as opposed to the supreme rulers. Some scholars have identified the Igigi with the stargazers and astronomers of the Anunnaki civilization, beings whose primary function was observation and record-keeping rather than governance or military command. Others have seen them as the infantry to the Anunnaki's officer class. What the Atrahasis epic makes clear is that the Igigi, whatever their precise status, were on the bottom of the hierarchy, doing the hardest work, and their patience eventually ran out. The connection between the Igigi's rebellion and the Tiamat faction's defeat is not made explicitly in a single text, but when we read the multiple texts in conjunction with each other, a coherent narrative emerges. Tiamat's faction represented a challenge to the established order. After Tiamat's defeat, those associated with her faction were demoted, disempowered, assigned to labor. The Igigi may well represent, at least in part, the surviving members of the losing faction, stripped of their status and assigned to working the mines on a planet they would not have chosen to inhabit. Their rebellion, then, is not merely a labor dispute. It is the continuing resistance of a defeated people who have not fully accepted the legitimacy of their defeat. An Enki solution, creating humanity to replace them, removes them from the immediate labor burden, but does not resolve the underlying tension, which will continue to manifest in the various conflicts between Enki and Enlil that run through the Earth phase texts. From the Book of Enoch, the losing side includes the Watchers, the beings who descended to Earth, formed relationships with human women, and transmitted forbidden knowledge to humanity. In the Book of Enoch's framework, the Watchers' descent and their subsequent punishment is understood as a theological problem, as divine beings transgressing divine law and suffering the appropriate consequences. But in the historical framework we are developing, the Watchers' actions look different. They look like members of a defeated faction, stripped of their original status and role, assigned to a monitoring function on a primitive planet, who chose to use what capabilities they still possessed to advance the development of the very species that had been created to serve the victors. In doing so, they were acting against Enlil's orders. They were, in the language of the hierarchy, criminals or rebels. But they might also have been understood, from another perspective, as beings who refused to accept the total defeat of their faction, who found a way to continue their side's agenda, even from a position of subordination. The knowledge that the Watchers gave to humanity is worth examining carefully, because it tells us something about what knowledge meant in the context of the Anunnaki War. Azazel taught metallurgy, the making of swords and shields and breastplates, and the craft of ornaments and cosmetics. Semyaza and his associates taught enchantments, the cutting of roots, and the knowledge of plants. Others taught astronomy and astrology, the movement of the moon, the signs of the sun. This knowledge was forbidden not because it was inherently dangerous in an abstract sense, but because it was the kind of knowledge that enabled self-sufficiency, a humanity that knew metallurgy did not need the Anunnaki to provide tools, a humanity that knew astronomy could track the celestial bodies for itself, a humanity that knew the medicinal properties of plants could heal itself. All of this knowledge moved humanity toward independence, toward the capacity to determine its own fate, away from the dependence on Anunnaki provision and direction that Enlil's design for humanity was intended to maintain. The Watchers, in transmitting this knowledge, were doing something that in modern terms we might call subversion. They were undermining the social architecture that the victors had imposed. They were arming the servant class with the intellectual tools to eventually refuse service. Whether they were conscious of this long-term effect, or whether they were motivated primarily by more immediate and personal considerations, such as love for their human partners and offspring, is not something the texts tell us directly. But the effect of their actions was, in Enlil's view, deeply threatening. The flood, which Enlil ultimately engineers, is in significant part a response to what the Watchers had done. It is an attempt to reset the human development trajectory, to destroy the generation of humans who had been contaminated with forbidden knowledge and start fresh with a more manageable population. Enki, of course, saves Atrahasis, the Noah figure of the Sumerian tradition, and with him enough of humanity to continue the species. Enki's intervention in the flood narrative is another instance of his characteristic pattern of behavior, finding a way to protect what he values against the decisions of those who have authority over him. He cannot defy Enlil directly. He cannot countermand Enlil's decree, but he can find a way around it, telling Atrahasis to build a boat without technically telling him why, in a way that preserves the critical elements while giving Enlil no direct grounds for objecting. The fate of the losing side, then, is complex. Some members of Tiamat's faction were destroyed, others were enslaved, others were demoted and reassigned. Some of those demoted beings, the Watchers among them, chose to resist their reduced status by aligning themselves with the humans who had been created to serve the victors. And through that alignment, through the forbidden knowledge they transmitted and the hybrid offspring they produced, something of the losing side's agenda and perhaps even some of its genetic legacy was preserved in humanity itself. The ancient texts suggest, in multiple traditions, that humans are not simply the creation of the victorious Anunnaki. We are, in some fundamental sense, also the product of those who lost. Enlil versus Enki, the war continues on Earth. The cosmic war between Tiamat and Marduk did not end with Marduk's victory. It continued, in a different form, under different names, in a different location, on Earth. The war continued as the long, complex, sometimes violent rivalry between Enlil and Enki, the two most powerful Anunnaki on the Earth mission, whose fundamental disagreements about the nature and future of humanity became the central organizing tension of everything that happened on this planet during the Anunnaki's tenure here. Understanding the Enlil-Enki conflict requires understanding what each of them believed about humanity and about the Earth mission. Enlil's position was, in its essential logic, coherent and even understandable. Humanity was created for a specific purpose: to relieve the Anunnaki of the burden of physical labor, particularly the mining of gold and other resources. Humans were tools, sophisticated tools, certainly, capable of following complex instructions and even of developing certain kinds of creativity, but tools nonetheless. The goal of the Earth mission was resource extraction for Nibiru. Humans were the means to that end. Any development of human capabilities that went beyond what was necessary for that function was at best wasteful and at worst dangerous. An intelligent, curious, self-sufficient species that had been genetically engineered by one of the Anunnaki's greatest scientists might, if allowed to develop freely, eventually grow to a scale and capability that threatened Anunnaki dominance. Enlil's restrictive management of humanity was therefore not mere cruelty. It was risk management, the calculated containment of a potential threat. The problem was that Enlil's risk management consistently looked like oppression and destructiveness, because from the human perspective, it was exactly that. Enki's position was equally coherent and equally understandable, though it led to radically different conclusions. Enki had created humanity, not in a merely administrative sense, not in the sense of approving the project and signing off on the specifications, but in the deep personal sense of doing the actual genetic work, of understanding the biological architecture he was building, of knowing intimately what these beings were capable of. He had used his own genetic material in the creation process according to multiple textual traditions, and that made humans, in a very real biological sense, his children. You do not create intelligent beings with curiosity and emotion and the capacity for love and art and music and wonder, and then manage them as tools without a profound moral cost to yourself. Enki refused to pay that cost. He refused to see in humanity only what Enlil wanted to see. He saw what he had put there, the potential for genuine consciousness, for growth, for the kind of wisdom that eventually transcends the intentions of those who shaped it. The conflict between these two positions drove the entire history of the Anunnaki's engagement with humanity, and it is worth tracing in detail because it illuminates the nature of the war's continuation on Earth in ways that help explain the world we currently inhabit. The specific episodes of the Enlil-Enki conflict are recorded across dozens of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, and they form a coherent narrative when read in sequence. The first major episode is the granting of wisdom to humanity. In the Sumerian myth known as Enki and the Tree of Knowledge, which corresponds closely to the Garden of Eden narrative in Genesis, the fundamental question is whether humans should have access to the knowledge of their own nature, the knowledge that would allow them to understand what they are, where they came from, and what they are capable of. Enlil's position is that they should not. The humans in the garden, Adamu and his companion, are meant to be workers, not thinkers. They are provided for, but they are kept in a state of managed ignorance about their own divine origins and potential. Enki, through a mechanism that the text describes as the serpent's advice, and Enki's symbol across multiple ancient traditions, is the serpent, the DNA-like double helix, the intertwined snakes of the caduceus, gives humanity access to the forbidden knowledge. The consequence in the Sumerian tradition, as in the Hebrew version, is expulsion from the garden, removal from the condition of managed dependency into the condition of conscious, self-determining existence. This is not a tragedy in Enki's framing. It is a liberation. It is humanity's first step towards self-determination. But from Enlil's perspective, it is a catastrophe and a betrayal. Enki has deliberately undermined the system that was working exactly as intended. He has introduced an instability into the human creation that will now require constant management. Humanity that knows its own divine heritage, that knows it carries Anunnaki genetics, that knows it was designed with a potential that extends beyond mining operations, is humanity that will eventually ask questions that Enlil does not want answered. It will ask, who made us? Why were we made? What else are we capable of? What do we owe those who made us? And most dangerously of all, what right do they have to rule us? These are not idle philosophical questions. In the Anunnaki framework, as the texts describe it, they are existential threats to the entire structure of the Earth mission. A humanity that understands its own origins might refuse to serve. A humanity that grasps its own genetic potential might develop capabilities that rival those of its creators. A humanity that demands to know the reasons behind the rules might reject the rules entirely. Enlil had understood this from the beginning, which is precisely why he had designed the system to prevent it. Enki had understood it too, which is precisely why he had chosen to circumvent the design. The second major episode is the flood. We have already touched on this, but it deserves deeper examination because the flood narrative is not simply a story about divine anger and human wickedness, as the later biblical tradition would frame it. The ancient Mesopotamian texts are considerably more specific about the causes and considerably more honest about the political motivations behind what is, when read carefully, not a natural disaster, but a policy decision. The Atrahasis epic is the most complete and most revealing account. The flood in this text does not arise because humanity has become morally corrupt in any theological sense. The text gives a different reason entirely, one that is almost never discussed in popular accounts of the flood story because it is so jarring in its implications. The reason given is noise. Humanity has become too numerous, too loud, too disruptive of Enlil's rest. The land had grown wide. The people had grown numerous. The land bellowed like wild oxen. The god was disturbed by their uproar. This is not a description of sin, it is a description of overpopulation and the management problem it creates. Humanity has grown beyond the scale that the Earth mission originally envisioned, and Enlil, who is above all an administrator and a risk manager, has decided that the problem requires a radical solution. But there is more. The text also records that Enki had been giving humans knowledge and capabilities that made them increasingly difficult to manage. Prior to the flood, Enlil attempts two lesser interventions, first plague, then drought, both of which Enki quietly undermines by giving humanity the information needed to survive them. Each time Enlil tries to reduce the human population or check human development, Enki finds a way to preserve what Enlil is trying to destroy. The flood is Enlil's attempt at a final solution to the Enki problem as much as it is an attempt to manage the human problem. By killing everyone, by starting over from a clean slate, Enlil hopes to reset not just the human population, but the trajectory of human development that Enki has been covertly steering for thousands of years. Enki's response is his most brilliant and most ethically complex act in the entire ancient textual tradition. He cannot tell Atrahasis directly that the flood is coming, because that would be an open defiance of Enlil's decree in the divine assembly, a defiance that would have consequences Enki cannot afford, so he speaks to the walls. The text is explicit about this. Enki speaks not to Atrahasis, but to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house, telling the wall what is coming, telling the wall what must be built, and allowing Atrahasis to overhear. It is a magnificent legal fiction, a bureaucratic workaround of extraordinary ingenuity. Enki did not tell humanity, he told the wall. What the wall communicated to the man on the other side of it is not his responsibility. The letter of Enlil's prohibition is technically preserved. The spirit of it is comprehensively violated, and humanity survives. After the flood, after Atrahasis emerges and the surviving humans and animals begin to multiply again, there is a confrontation between Enlil and Enki that the ancient text records with an honesty that is almost shocking. Enlil is furious. The plan failed. Humanity survived. Enki's fingerprints are all over the survival. Enlil demands to know how this happened, and Enki, without quite admitting what he did, argues his position with characteristic directness. I made sure life was preserved so that the craftsmanship of the gods would not be lost. I made sure that the seeds of life were not entirely destroyed. The argument is not that Enki was justified in breaking the rules. The argument is that what Enlil was destroying was irreplaceable, that the humans, with all their complexity and all their dangerous potential, represented a kind of value that could not simply be thrown away without profound loss to everyone, including the Anunnaki themselves. This argument between Enlil and Enki after the flood represents, in compressed form, the fundamental philosophical disagreement that has defined the relationship between power and wisdom in every civilization on Earth since the Anunnaki's time. Enlil's position: the mission parameters must be maintained, the resources must be extracted, the labor force must be controlled, whatever threatens the system must be eliminated. Enki's position: the beings you are managing are not mere instruments. They are, in some sense, that cannot be reduced to utility, ends in themselves. Their destruction is not a management solution, it is a crime. And the fact that you have the authority to commit it does not make it any less a crime. The Enlil-Enki conflict does not resolve. That is one of the most important things to understand about the ancient texts. There is no scene in which Enlil finally concedes that Enki was right, no moment in which Enki's patient advocacy for humanity is vindicated by a change of Enlil's heart. What there is, instead, is the gradual shift of influence, the slow, grinding transfer of authority from Enlil's line to other lines, the proliferation of Anunnaki political factions on Earth that mirrors, in compressed historical time, the factional warfare that had destroyed Nibiru's political unity before the Earth mission ever began. The war did not end when they came to Earth. The Earth became the new battlefield. Humanity became both the prize and the weapon. The genetic question: what were we actually made from? Of all the claims made in the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts about the creation of humanity, none is more specific, none is more scientifically testable in principle, and none is more disturbing in its implications than the claim about the genetic mechanism of human creation. The texts do not describe a god forming a human from clay and breathing life into him in a vague, poetic way, though later traditions would simplify the account to that. The original Mesopotamian texts describe something far more specific and far more technically coherent with modern genetics. A deliberate process of genetic modification conducted by Enki with the assistance of a medical goddess named Ninhursag, in which existing biological material was altered to create the human species. The key Sumerian term is Lulu Amelu, meaning the mixed being or the primitive worker. The texts describe humans as a mixture, a hybrid, a combination of existing genetic material. Specifically, in the Atrahasis epic and in supporting texts from Nippur and elsewhere, the creation of the first humans involved mixing the blood, which is to say the genetic material, of a divine being with the clay, which is to say the biological matter, of an existing creature. The divine being whose blood was used was, in the Atrahasis account, the god Wi-Ila, a god who is slaughtered for the purpose, whose spirit is then carried by all subsequent humans. In the Enuma Elish version, it is Kingu's blood that is used. The specific identity of the divine being varies across textual traditions, but the mechanism is consistent. Human beings were created by mixing divine genetic material with the biological substrate of a pre-existing species. The pre-existing species is, in the context of everything we know about evolutionary biology, almost certainly Homo erectus, or a closely related archaic human species. The Earth, when the Anunnaki arrived, was already populated with hominids that had been evolving for millions of years. These beings walked upright. They used tools. They had some capacity for social organization and communication. But they lacked, apparently, whatever the Anunnaki needed in a labor force: the cognitive capacity for complex instruction following, the manual dexterity for sophisticated mining and processing operations, the communicative capacity to be directed with precision. What Enki did, in the terms the ancient texts describe, was take the existing biological architecture of the indigenous hominid and upgrade it, inserting genetic material from the Anunnaki themselves to produce a being with significantly enhanced cognitive and communicative capacities. The scientific parallel here is one that researchers in the field of ancient DNA and human evolutionary genetics have been struggling with for decades. The human fossil and genetic record contains several features that do not fit neatly into a simple model of gradual, linear evolution from earlier hominid forms. The most significant of these is the question of the Great Leap Forward, the apparently sudden appearance, roughly 50,000 years ago, of behavioral modernity in the human archaeological record. Abstract art, complex tool manufacture, long-distance trade networks, musical instruments, structured burial practices, all appearing in a relatively compressed time frame after a much longer period in which human cognitive development had been comparatively slow. Some researchers attribute this to a genetic mutation that reorganized neural wiring in ways that enabled the full range of human cognitive complexity. Others attribute it to cultural accumulation reaching a tipping point. But the suddenness and the comprehensiveness of the change have never been fully explained by either model. The ancient texts would offer a different explanation. The Great Leap Forward is not the result of a random mutation or a cultural threshold. It is the result of a specific genetic intervention, or perhaps a series of interventions that modified the existing hominid template in ways that produced behavioral modernity as a designed outcome rather than an evolutionary accident. The timing varies depending on which phase of Anunnaki genetic experimentation we are talking about. And the texts actually describe multiple rounds of creation, multiple attempts and revisions before the modern human model was achieved. The first humans were, according to the texts, incapable of reproduction, created as individual units rather than as a self-sustaining species. It was only in a later phase, a modification that Enki and Ninhursag made after Enlil objected to the first design, that humans were given the capacity for self-reproduction, transforming them from a managed population of individual created beings into a genuinely self-perpetuating species. This specific detail, the initial creation of humans without reproductive capacity followed by a subsequent modification that enabled reproduction, is remarkable in the context of modern genetics because it corresponds to the distinction between somatic genetic modification and germline genetic modification. A somatic modification affects only the individual organism. A germline modification affects the reproductive cells and is therefore inherited by all subsequent generations. The initial human creation, in the textual account, was a somatic project. Beings modified for specific characteristics without those modifications being heritable. The subsequent modification, granting reproductive capacity, was a germline intervention. It altered the reproductive architecture in a way that would propagate through all subsequent generations. The ancient texts are describing, in their own vocabulary, a distinction that modern genetic scientists understand with great precision. There is also the matter of the Anunnaki's own genetic contribution. If human beings were indeed created by mixing Anunnaki genetic material with indigenous hominid material, then we would expect the result to be a being that is neither fully Anunnaki nor fully hominid, but something genuinely intermediate. And here, modern genetics provides a remarkable data point. The human genome is anomalous in a number of ways that have puzzled evolutionary geneticists for decades. We have far fewer genes than expected for organisms of our complexity. We have a genome that appears to have undergone significant non-gradual reorganization at certain points in the evolutionary past. We carry in our genome traces of genetic material from multiple other hominid species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. But the pattern of that admixture does not follow the straightforward model of two populations interbreeding randomly. It suggests a more structured, more directed process of genetic exchange. Most provocatively, there is the question of chromosome 2. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Our closest primate relatives, the great apes, have 48. Somewhere in the evolutionary lineage leading to modern humans, 2 chromosomes fused into one. The fusion site in human chromosome 2 is identifiable. It contains telomeric sequences in the middle, where chromosomes should not have them, because those sequences are normally only at chromosome ends, and they are present because this was once the end of 2 separate chromosomes that were joined together. This fusion is real. It happened. The question is how and when and why. The standard evolutionary answer is that it was a random chromosomal fusion event that proved to be non-lethal and eventually became fixed in the population. That is a plausible answer, but it is also, as geneticists acknowledge, a remarkable event. Chromosomal fusions are usually lethal or severely deleterious when they occur as random mutations because they disrupt the process of meiosis and typically render the organism carrying them reproductively incompatible with the rest of the population. For a fusion to become fixed, it must somehow spread through an entire population, despite this reproductive disadvantage, or it must occur in a way that bypasses the problem, perhaps by being deliberately introduced into a founding population rather than arising randomly in a single individual. We are not claiming that modern genetics has confirmed the ancient Sumerian account of human creation. We are claiming that the ancient Sumerian account of human creation is considerably more coherent with what modern genetics actually shows than is generally acknowledged, and that the anomalies in the human genome are precisely what you would expect to find if the account in the ancient texts were literally true. The convergence is not proof, but it is not nothing, and it deserves serious, honest engagement rather than dismissal. The human purpose and the hidden inheritance. We have been building toward a question that the ancient texts address with disturbing directness, a question that, if the texts are to be believed, is the most important question that any human being can ask. What are we for? Not in the abstract philosophical sense, not in the religious sense of seeking divine purpose, but in the concrete, operational sense. What was the design intent of those who created us? What were we built to do? And perhaps even more importantly, what were we built to become? The official answer, the answer that Enlil's design and Enlil's management of humanity was intended to maintain as the only answer, is straightforward. We were built to work, to mine gold, to build cities, to perform the physical labor that the Igigi had refused, to serve the Anunnaki mission without question, without ambition beyond our assigned function, without awareness of our own divine heritage or potential. In Enlil's vision, the perfect human was a highly capable but ultimately obedient instrument, sophisticated enough to follow complex instructions, but not sophisticated enough to question them. This is the vision of humanity as a managed resource, and it is a vision whose shadow, we might argue, still falls across human civilization in the form of every system that has ever reduced human beings to units of labor, to means rather than ends, to instruments of another's purposes rather than agents of their own. But Enki's answer, the answer encoded in the genetic design that Enki insisted on over Enlil's objections, and the answer further elaborated by the knowledge that the Watchers transmitted to the Nephilim generation, is something very different. Enki designed humans with more than was necessary for the mining function. He gave us the cognitive architecture for abstract reasoning, for scientific inquiry, for art and music and narrative, for the kind of self-reflective consciousness that asks not just, how do I do this, but why am I doing this, and what else could I be? He gave us, in short, the capacity to eventually surpass the function we were designed to perform and to become something that even our designers might not have fully anticipated. This is the hidden inheritance that the ancient texts point to with insistent consistency across every tradition that touches on the story of human origins. The Sumerian texts speak of humanity carrying the spirit of the slain divine being whose blood went into our creation, a spirit that is not extinguished by the creation event but lives on in every human being, restless and seeking. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers transmitting knowledge that was specifically the kind of knowledge that enables self-determination, astronomical knowledge that makes humans cosmologically aware, metallurgical knowledge that makes humans technologically capable, medical knowledge that makes humans biologically independent. The Egyptian tradition, which we have not yet fully explored, describes Thoth, the divine being of wisdom and writing, who corresponds closely to Enki in his functions and character, giving humanity the gift of writing and mathematics not as tools of servitude, but as the foundations of civilization, as the means by which human beings could begin to record and transmit and build upon their own knowledge across generations, eventually accumulating a store of understanding that could, in principle, approach the understanding of the gods themselves. This is what Enlil feared, not simply a humanity that was too numerous or too noisy or too inconvenient, but a humanity that, if allowed to develop along the trajectory that Enki had built into the design, would eventually ask the right questions, develop the right capabilities, and arrive at a position of genuine power and genuine self-determination. A humanity that knew what it was, where it came from, and what it was capable of, was a humanity that might decide that the arrangement with the Anunnaki was no longer acceptable. That might decide that the gold belonged to no one or to everyone. That might decide that the question of who determines human destiny was a question that humans had the right to answer for themselves. The ancient texts, when read as a continuous narrative, tell the story of a civilization fighting to prevent that moment from arriving. Enlil's series of interventions, the garden restrictions, the deliberate limitation of human lifespan, the flood, the confusion of languages at what the Hebrew tradition calls Babel, each of these is an attempt to reset the human development trajectory, to prevent the accumulation of knowledge and capability across generations that would eventually produce the kind of humanity that could not be managed. Each of these interventions delays the process, but does not stop it. And each time Enlil intervenes, Enki finds a way to preserve the thread, to ensure that the critical elements of human potential survive into the next generation, hidden sometimes in bloodlines, in mystery traditions, in knowledge preserved by the survivors of whatever catastrophe Enlil's management had just imposed. The Watchers' transmission of forbidden knowledge to the Nephilim generation was not an isolated incident. It was, in this reading, one episode in a longer pattern of resistance, one moment in a continuous effort by Enki's allies and by those who shared Enki's vision of humanity to ensure that the full inheritance of human potential potential was not suppressed permanently. The mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved in the design of the great monuments, the philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, with their curious mixture of rational inquiry and divine origin mythology, the alchemical traditions of the medieval world, with their consistent underlying interest in transformation and transcendence, the scientific revolution with its sudden, accelerating expansion of human knowledge and capability across exactly the domains that the Watchers had originally transmitted as forbidden knowledge. All of these can be read in the light of the ancient texts as successive expressions of the same underlying drive. The drive to remember what we are, the drive to recover what was taken from us, the drive to become what we were, perhaps, originally designed to become. And that brings us finally to the question that the ancient Sumerian scribes who pressed these accounts into wet clay tablets almost certainly did not think they were raising for us, but that their records, preserved across millennia against every effort of time and destruction, have nonetheless delivered to our doorstep. The question is not whether the Anunnaki war happened. The question is whether it is over. The question is whether the forces that have been managing human development throughout recorded history, whether we understand those forces as literal extraterrestrial beings or as the institutional and ideological descendants of the systems they established, whether they are still operating, still trying to maintain the design parameters that Enlil imposed, still resisting the development that Enki encoded into our very cells. Because if the ancient texts are right, if the war that began somewhere in the heavens before Earth has continued in every generation of human history in one form or another, then we are not merely students of ancient history. We are participants in an ongoing conflict whose terms were set before our first ancestor drew breath, whose stakes are nothing less than the question of what humanity is allowed to be, and whose outcome has not yet been decided. The tablets told us the beginning, they hid the ending inside us, and we are only now, in this extraordinary and dangerous and promising moment, developing the tools to read what was written there. The physical record, what the Earth itself remembers. There is a problem with ancient history that most people never think about, and it is this. We tend to assume that what survives is representative of what existed. We look at the ruins of Mesopotamia, at the clay tablets and the mud brick ziggurats and the carved cylinder seals, and we unconsciously conclude that what we see is more or less what was there, that the ancient world was more or less as primitive as its surviving artifacts suggest. But this assumption is deeply, perhaps catastrophically, wrong. Stone survives, clay survives, gold survives, but wood rots. Fabric disintegrates, organic compounds break down into their constituent elements and become indistinguishable from the surrounding soil within centuries, let alone millennia. And the materials we use for our most advanced technologies, our silicon chips, our fiber optic cables, our polymer composites, would leave almost no recognizable trace in the geological record after 50,000 years of weathering, erosion, and biological activity. If an advanced civilization existed on Earth 100,000 years ago, or 500,000 years ago, or 2 million years ago, and used materials and technologies that were primarily organic, primarily polymer-based, primarily built from materials that decompose efficiently in the presence of water and bacteria, we would not necessarily find it. We would find, at best, anomalies, traces of heat where there should be no heat, chemical signatures that do not fit the expected profile of natural processes, geological layers disturbed in ways that simple erosion does not explain. We would find, in other words, exactly what geologists and archaeologists have been quietly cataloging for a century and a half and largely declining to discuss openly because the implications are too disruptive to the existing frameworks within which academic careers are built and maintained. Let us begin with the most famous anomaly of all, the one that has generated more controversy, more dismissal, and more persistent fascination than any other physical structure on Earth, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The standard account of the Great Pyramid's construction, the account you will find in most textbooks and museum exhibits, goes something like this. The pyramid was built around 2560 BCE by Pharaoh Khufu using a workforce of approximately 20 to 30,000 laborers, working with copper tools, wooden sledges, ramps made of earth and brick, and an organizational system of considerable sophistication to produce a monument to royal power and the afterlife that required approximately 20 years to complete. This account is not a fabrication. It is based on genuine archaeological evidence, genuine historical records, genuine analysis of the site and its surroundings, and yet it leaves unexplained a set of engineering specifics that have troubled architects, engineers, and physicists for as long as those fields have existed in their modern forms. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of 2.5 to 15 tons each, with some granite blocks in the internal chambers weighing as much as 80 tons. Those 80-ton granite blocks were quarried at Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers from Giza, transported by some means to the site, and lifted to heights of over 40 meters with a degree of precision that modern engineers find extraordinary. The casing stones that originally covered the pyramid, most of which were removed in the medieval period to build Cairo's mosques, were fitted together with joints of less than 0.5 millimeters, thinner than a human hair, over an area of approximately 5.5 hectares. The pyramid's base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length. The four sides are oriented to true north, south, east, and west with an error of less than 0.06 degrees, an accuracy that was not achievable by European surveyors until the development of precision theodolites in the 18th century. The pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical constants that the Egyptians should not, by the standard historical account, have possessed. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height, when calculated, gives a value to a precision of better than 0.1%. The pyramid's height, multiplied by 10 to the 9th power, approximates the mean distance from the Earth to the Sun. The ratio of the pyramid's base to its height gives the golden ratio, phi, again to a precision that exceeds what would be expected from coincidence. Egyptologists have argued with varying degrees of conviction that these mathematical relationships are either coincidental or the result of the Egyptians using pi and phi in practical construction methods without necessarily having theoretical knowledge of them as mathematical abstractions. But the precision and the multiplicity of the encoded relationships strains that explanation considerably. None of this proves Anunnaki involvement, but it raises a question that the standard account does not satisfactorily answer. Where did the organizational knowledge, the mathematical sophistication, and the precision engineering capability come from? Egyptian civilization in the standard chronology goes from scattered Neolithic settlements to the construction of the most precisely engineered large structure in human history in a period of roughly 1,000 years, with no obvious developmental trajectory that accounts for the endpoint. The earliest examples of Egyptian architecture are already remarkably sophisticated. There is no clear gradual progression from primitive to advanced that you would expect to see if the knowledge were being developed organically through trial and error over generations. It appears, in the archaeological record, almost fully formed. The ancient Egyptian texts themselves are quite clear about where the knowledge came from. It came from the gods. Specifically, it came from Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom and writing and mathematics and measurement, who in the Egyptian tradition gave humanity the gifts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and sacred architecture. Thoth, in the oldest Egyptian texts, is described not as a figure of myth, but as a historical person, a divine being who lived among the Egyptians in a period called Zep Tepi, the first time, or time of the gods, and who transmitted the knowledge that became the foundation of Egyptian civilization. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, found carved in the burial chambers of the 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids, describe this first time with a matter-of-fact specificity that is not characteristic of mythological invention. Something happened in a period before the historical dynasties that the Egyptians understood as the literal, physical presence of divine beings on earth. Beings who taught and organized and directed the establishment of a civilization whose achievements still stagger the modern mind. Thoth's counterpart in Mesopotamia is Enki. The parallels between these two figures are too consistent and too specific to be coincidental. Both are associated with wisdom and writing and mathematics. Both are associated with water and the deep. Both are described as the creators or civilizers of humanity in their respective traditions. Both are characterized by their relationship with forbidden or sacred knowledge and their willingness to share it with humanity against the wishes of a higher authority. The convergence of these two figures across two independent civilizational traditions suggests strongly that they are both describing the same being or the same class of beings, and that what the Egyptians called Thoth and the Sumerians called Enki was not a god in the metaphorical sense, but an actual historical entity whose activities in the earliest period of human civilization left traces in both textual traditions. Zep-Tepi, the first time of Egyptian mythology, corresponds remarkably well with a specific astronomical period, approximately 10,500 BCE, when the constellation Orion was at the lowest point of its 26,000-year precessional cycle, and when the Sphinx, oriented due east, would have faced directly toward the rising of its own celestial counterpart, the constellation Leo, at the spring equinox. The architectural researcher Robert Bauval demonstrated in the early 1990s that the three pyramids of Giza are arranged in a precise correspondence with the three belt stars of Orion, and that this correspondence is most accurate for the sky as it appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE, not in 2,500 BCE when the pyramids were supposedly built. The Sphinx's geological weathering, analyzed independently by geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, shows patterns of rainfall erosion that are inconsistent with the climate of Egypt for the last 5,000 years, but consistent with the much wetter climate of Egypt in the period between 7,000 and 10,000 BCE, suggesting that the Sphinx may be considerably older than the standard chronology allows. If the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx were designed to encode astronomical information about 10,500 BCE, and if the Sphinx bears geological evidence of existing in a form recognizable enough to be weathered by rainfall from a period ending around 7,000 BCE, then we are dealing with a monument program that either began in a period of human civilization that the standard chronology does not recognize, or was designed by beings who were astronomically sophisticated enough to encode precession cycle information about a period thousands of years before the monuments were physically built. Both possibilities are extraordinary, neither is comfortably accommodated by the standard account. And the Great Pyramid is not alone. It is the most famous and the most analyzed of a global distribution of anomalous ancient monuments that share several characteristics: a degree of astronomical alignment that implies sophisticated knowledge of precession and celestial mechanics, a degree of engineering precision that challenges or exceeds what the surrounding historical context of each monument's supposed construction period can readily explain, and a geometric and mathematical sophistication that, in multiple cases, encodes relationships that the cultures responsible for their construction were supposedly not yet aware of as formal knowledge. We find this pattern at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, currently the oldest monumental structure yet discovered, dating to at least 9600 BCE and possibly earlier, built by people who, by the standard archaeological account, were hunter-gatherers without agriculture or settled civilization, yet who somehow organized the quarrying and erection of massive T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with sophisticated relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circles with precise geometric organization. We find it at Puma Punku in Bolivia, where H-shaped stone blocks of andesite and red sandstone are fitted together with interlocking precision that requires cuts of extraordinary accuracy, where straight grooves have been cut into the hardest stone available with a regularity that implies the use of tools or jigs rather than handwork. We find it at Nan Madol in Micronesia, a city built on artificial islands in a lagoon, constructed from massive basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons each, transported from quarries on the far side of the island by means that no satisfactory conventional explanation has yet been offered. The global distribution of these anomalous sites is itself significant. They are not clustered in one region. They are not the product of one civilization that might have developed a particularly advanced technology and exported it. They appear on every inhabited continent, in cultures that had no documented contact with each other, in periods ranging from the deep prehistoric to the historical, with a consistency of certain engineering and astronomical characteristics that implies either independent convergence on the same solutions, which strains credulity given the precision involved, or a common source of knowledge and technique, a common teacher, active across the world in the period of what the Egyptians called the first time and what the Sumerians called the antediluvian period. The ancient texts tell us what that common source was. It was the Anunnaki, or beings associated with the Anunnaki, in the period before the flood reorganized the human world and severed most of humanity's direct connection to its divine teachers. The knowledge that produced Göbekli Tepe and the Sphinx and Puma Punku and the astronomical alignments encoded in monuments from Ireland to Cambodia was not developed independently by the cultures in whose territories these monuments stand. It was given, transmitted, taught in the first time, and then preserved imperfectly and fragmentarily through the catastrophes that followed. The blood of kings, genetic evidence, and the divine lineage. The ancient texts are not merely interested in the creation of humanity in general. They are intensely, almost obsessively interested in specific lineages, specific family trees, specific bloodlines that carry something different, something more, something that connects them back to the divine beings who created and shaped the human species. The Sumerian king list, which we mentioned earlier, does not just record the names of kings and the lengths of their reigns. It records a transition from the antediluvian period, when the beings who ruled had lifespans of tens of thousands of years, to the post-diluvian period, when lifespans drop precipitously but remain extraordinary by modern standards, to the fully historical period, when kings have lifespans recognizable as human. This is not simply mythological exaggeration of the kind every ancient culture indulges in to glorify its rulers. The specific pattern of the lifespan reduction, the way it drops in stages rather than all at once, is what you would expect from a genetic dilution process. Beings of great longevity mixing with shorter-lived humans over multiple generations, with each generation showing reduced longevity as the divine genetic contribution becomes a smaller fraction of the total genome. The concept of a divine or semi-divine bloodline is not unique to the Sumerian tradition. It appears with remarkable consistency across ancient cultures that had no documented contact with each other. The Egyptian pharaohs were understood as literally divine, as beings in whom the blood of the gods was present in a concentration that distinguished them from ordinary humans, not merely symbolically, but biologically. The Chinese emperors were described as sons of heaven, their mandate to rule, understood as flowing from a divine ancestry that connected them to the primordial divine beings who had organized the cosmos. The Indian Vedic tradition, which we have not yet explored in depth, contains extensive genealogies of the ancient divine kings, the rulers of the antediluvian period called the Manvantaras, whose reigns are described in terms of cosmic time cycles of immense duration. The Norse tradition preserves the Aesir lineage, the family of Odin and Thor, and the other divine beings who interacted with humans, and whose descendants, the semi-divine heroes, possessed capabilities that ordinary humans did not. The Greek tradition is saturated with half-divine heroes, children of gods and mortal women whose extraordinary capabilities are understood as the expression of the divine genetic component in their makeup. The convergence of all of these traditions on the same basic biological concept, that certain human lineages carry genetic material from a non-human intelligent species that created or significantly modified humanity, and that this genetic material confers specific advantages in terms of longevity, cognitive capacity, and possibly other characteristics, is too consistent to dismiss as parallel mythological invention. The ancient world was telling us something about human genetics that modern science is only now developing the tools to investigate seriously. Here, the modern genetic data becomes genuinely fascinating and genuinely controversial. The sequencing of the human genome, completed in 2003 and continuously refined since then, has revealed a number of genetic anomalies that do not fit neatly into the standard model of gradual evolution from earlier hominid forms. We have already mentioned the chromosome 2 fusion, but there are others, less famous but equally intriguing. human beings show evidence of what geneticists call a population bottleneck at some point in the relatively recent evolutionary past, a period when the total breeding population of humans was reduced to a remarkably small number. Estimates vary, but some analyses of mitochondrial DNA diversity suggest that at some point the total human population capable of reproduction may have been as small as a few thousand individuals, possibly even a few hundred. This bottleneck is real. It is visible in the reduced genetic diversity of modern humans compared to what you would expect given our population size and geographic distribution. The timing of the bottleneck, estimated at somewhere between 70,000 and 150,000 years ago in most analyses, corresponds intriguingly to both the proposed period of the Toba supervolcanic eruption, which would have caused a volcanic winter severe enough to dramatically reduce global hominid populations, and to the period in which the ancient texts locate the creation of modern humanity. But there is a subtler anomaly that is less widely discussed. The mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through the maternal line, and the Y-chromosomal Adam, the most recent common ancestor through the paternal line, lived at very different times. The mitochondrial Eve is estimated to have lived approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Y-chromosomal Adam is estimated to have lived approximately 200,000 to 340,000 years ago in more recent analyses, though earlier estimates placed him much closer in time to mitochondrial Eve. The discrepancy between these two dates is larger than simple random genetic drift easily explains, and it has generated significant discussion in the population genetics literature. One possible explanation, not commonly offered but not logically excluded, is that the maternal and paternal lineages of modern humanity have different origins, that the founding population of modern humans was not the product of a single interbreeding event or a single population, but of a more complex mixing of genetic lineages, one of which may have been introduced from outside the existing hominid population. This is not a proof, it is an anomaly. But when you accumulate enough anomalies, when you find that the human genome is unusual in the chromosome 2 fusion, in the population bottleneck timing, in the mitochondrial Y-chromosomal discrepancy, in the unusually high levels of certain regulatory genes involved in brain development that show signs of recent and rapid positive selection, in the presence of genetic sequences that do not appear in any other living primate and whose function is not yet fully understood, you begin to wonder whether the standard model is missing something important. The ancient texts would tell you that it is. They would tell you that modern humanity is not the product of unguided evolution from earlier hominid forms, but is instead the product of a deliberate genetic intervention that combined existing hominid material with something else, something that left its mark in our genome in ways that we are only now developing the sensitivity to detect. The bloodlines of the ancient kings, in this reading, were not mythological constructs designed to legitimize political authority, though they served that purpose secondarily. They were records of genetic lineage, tracking which human families carried higher concentrations of the Anunnaki genetic contribution, which families had more recent or more direct connections to the divine beings who had created and shaped humanity. The extraordinary lifespans attributed to the antediluvian kings in the Sumerian king list were not exaggerations. They were phenotypic expressions of a genome that was closer to the Anunnaki original than the genome of ordinary humans. And as those bloodlines mixed with the broader human population over generations, as the divine genetic component was diluted by reproduction with humans who carried less of it, the lifespans and capabilities came down to what we consider normal human parameters. But the dilution was not uniform. The ancient texts consistently describe the survival, in specific families and specific lineages, of concentrations of divine genetic material that maintained certain characteristics across generations. The bloodline of Noah, preserved through the flood. The bloodline of Shem, from whom the Semitic peoples were understood to descend. The bloodline of the Egyptian pharaohs, maintained through a system of royal marriage that prioritized genetic consolidation over political alliance. The bloodline of the ancient Indian rishis, the seers and sages whose extraordinary longevity and wisdom the Vedic texts record with the same matter-of-fact specificity as the Sumerian king list. These traditions were not merely asserting special spiritual status, they were describing biological reality as the ancient world understood it. Some human lineages carry more of the divine inheritance than others, and that inheritance matters, not for social privilege, but for human potential. This is, we must acknowledge, an idea with a deeply troubled history. Every ideology of racial superiority in human history has drawn on some version of the concept of differential genetic inheritance to justify hierarchies of power and worth. We want to be absolutely clear about something. The ancient texts do not support those ideologies. Quite the reverse. The divine genetic inheritance, as described in the texts, is not associated with any particular modern ethnic or racial group. It is described as having been distributed globally through the Watcher's relationships with human women from multiple populations, through the post-flood dispersal of Noah's lineage across all the regions of the ancient world, through the deliberate policy of certain Anunnaki who work to preserve the full potential of humanity across multiple bloodlines, rather than concentrating it in a single favored group. The Anunnaki themselves were not unified on this question, as we have seen. Enlil wanted to manage and restrict, while Enki wanted to preserve and expand. And Enki's policy, as the texts describe it, was explicitly non-discriminatory. He worked with whatever human populations were accessible to him in Mesopotamia and in Africa, and, the texts suggest, in other regions as well. The significance of the genetic question is not who has more divine heritage and who has less. The significance is what the divine heritage means for all of us collectively as a species. If the ancient texts are right, if humanity is a hybrid species carrying the genetic legacy of a civilization that had solved problems we are only beginning to approach, then the full potential of that legacy has never been expressed. It has been managed, restricted, diluted, suppressed by a succession of catastrophes, some natural and some engineered, that repeatedly interrupted the development trajectory that Enki's design made possible. The question of when and how that full potential will finally be expressed, or whether it will be expressed at all, is not a question about one lineage or one people. It is a question about humanity as a whole, about what we were built to become, about whether the war that created us will ultimately produce the outcome that the losing side and Enki, and perhaps the deepest and most ambitious part of the Anunnaki design, intended. The return, what the ancient texts say will happen next. The ancient texts do not merely describe the past, they describe the future. And the future they describe, in traditions ranging from the Sumerian to the Vedic to the Hebrew to the Norse to the Mesoamerican, follows a pattern that is, when examined carefully, not a collection of independent apocalyptic visions, but a single coherent prophecy emerging from a single underlying understanding of the structure of history and the eventual resolution of the war that began it. The Sumerian texts describe a cycle. Nibiru, on its long elliptical orbit, returns periodically to the inner solar system. Each return is associated with disruption, gravitational perturbations that affect Earth's tectonic and electromagnetic systems. Electromagnetic effects from the interaction of Nibiru's extensive magnetosphere with Earth's own, and, critically, the return of the Anunnaki themselves, who are understood as traveling with Nibiru, or at least as using Nibiru's close approach as the occasion for contact with Earth. The most recent close approach in this reckoning corresponds to the period of the Great Flood, an event that the texts attribute partly to the gravitational effects of Nibiru's passage and partly to deliberate Anunnaki intervention. The next return is described in multiple textual traditions as the occasion for a final resolution of the conflict that has defined human history since the beginning. The Hebrew prophetic tradition, drawing on Sumerian and Babylonian antecedents that its authors clearly had access to during the Babylonian captivity, describes this resolution in terms of a cosmic judgment, a final determination of fates that corresponds structurally to the divine assembly of the Anunnaki making a final collective decision about the future of humanity and of Earth. The Book of Daniel, with its 4 world empires and its mysterious Ancient of Days sitting in judgment while the records of humanity are opened and examined, is describing a political event in Anunnaki terms. the Book of Revelation, which draws on Daniel and on even older Mesopotamian imagery, including the seven-headed dragon, the war in heaven, the binding of the ancient serpent, and the thousand-year reign of the righteous, is not merely Christian eschatology. It is the final chapter of the Anunnaki story, encoded in the symbolic vocabulary of a tradition that had preserved the underlying narrative structure for thousands of years. The Norse Ragnarok describes the final battle between the Aesir and their enemies, a battle that results in the destruction of the existing world and the emergence of a new one, green and fertile, from the waters, populated by the survivors who had been hidden away to seed the new cycle. The Vedic Yugas describe a cycle of cosmic ages, from the golden age of the Satya Yuga to the degraded age of the Kali Yuga, in which we currently find ourselves, with the end of the Kali Yuga marked by the return of a divine being, the avatar Kalki, who resolves the accumulated injustices of the current age and inaugurates a new golden age. The Mesoamerican long count calendar, whose much-discussed endpoint in 2012 was widely misunderstood as a prediction of apocalypse, actually describes not an ending but a transition, the end of one great cycle and the beginning of another, associated in the Mayan tradition with the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity whose symbol, like Enki's, is the intertwined serpents and who promised to return from the east at the appointed time. The serpent god, the feathered or winged serpent, is perhaps the single most globally distributed divine symbol in ancient human religion. He appears in Mesopotamia as Enki, marked by the intertwined snakes that we still use, without understanding why, as the symbol of medicine. He appears in Egypt as Thoth and as the uraeus serpent that adorns the crowns of the pharaohs, marking them as under divine protection. He appears in India as the Naga, the divine serpent beings of the Vedic tradition, who are simultaneously terrifying and wise, guardians of ancient treasures and transmitters of sacred knowledge. He appears in Mesoamerica as Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, the feathered serpent civilization bringer who taught agriculture and astronomy and writing before departing across the sea and promising to return. He appears in the Norse tradition as the world serpent Jormungandr, the great circling snake that marks the boundary of the known world. He appears in the Hebrew tradition as the Serpent of Eden, whose advice gave humanity its first taste of divine knowledge and its first experience of divine wrath. The global distribution of the divine serpent symbol and the consistency with which that symbol is associated with wisdom, with knowledge, with divine human contact, with the transmission of civilization's foundations, and with a future return, points to something that all of these traditions are describing from different cultural angles: the presence of a specific being or class of beings associated with the serpent as their totem or their biological marker, who interacted with humanity in the founding period of all the world's major civilizations, and who are expected to return. If the ancient texts are to be believed, that return is not an indefinite future event. It is structured, as all things in the Anunnaki system are structured, according to cycles, according to astronomical timing, according to the orbital mechanics of a world that visits our solar system on a schedule that, from a human perspective, spans generations, but that, from the Anunnaki perspective, is as regular and predictable as the seasons. And if those cycles are what the texts describe, and if the period we are currently living through corresponds to what multiple independent ancient traditions identify as the closing of one great cycle and the opening of another, then the question is not whether the resolution of the ancient war is approaching. The question is what form that resolution will take. The ancient texts offer two possibilities, and both are present simultaneously in the prophetic traditions. The first possibility is that the return of the Anunnaki represents the restoration of a hierarchy, the reassertion of the old order in which humanity serves purposes that are not its own, in which the design parameters that Enlil imposed are reinstated with whatever modifications the current state of human development requires. In this scenario, the return is not liberation. It is, at best, the return of a managed existence under the authority of beings who, whatever else they are, have consistently demonstrated that their primary interest in humanity is as a resource, a labor force, a means to their own ends. The gilded cage is comfortable, but it is still a cage. The second possibility, The one that the traditions associated with Enki and with his multiple counterparts across the world's religious heritage consistently point toward is that the return represents something different, that the trajectory Enki encoded into the human genome, the drive toward self-determination, toward wisdom, toward the full expression of the divine inheritance, has advanced far enough in the current cycle that humanity is no longer what it was when the last great resolution was attempted, that we have developed despite everything, despite the floods and the language confusions and the deliberate suppression of knowledge and the management of human development by forces that preferred us manageable to magnificent, far enough along the path that Enki designed, that the question of our status, whether we are tools or beings, whether we are means or ends, whether the war that created us was fought for our benefit or at our expense, is now genuinely open in a way that it has not been at any previous point in the cycle. We are, in this reading, at the moment that the war has always been building toward, the moment when the creation surpasses the design parameters of those who built it for one purpose and discovers that it was made by the deepest and most deliberate choices of its most far-sighted maker for another purpose entirely, not to serve, not to mine, not to be managed and controlled and periodically culled when the population grows inconveniently large, but to become, over the vast arc of the time that was required, something worthy of the divine heritage that was written into our cells before we drew our first breath. Whether that is what is happening, whether the extraordinary turbulence of the current period in human history represents the labor pains of that becoming, or merely another cycle of managed crisis, is not a question that the ancient texts can answer for us. That is a question that we have to answer. Because if the texts are right, if the war continues and its resolution is not yet determined, then the outcome depends not on the Anunnaki, not on the returning gods, or the ancient hierarchy or the management systems they left in place. It depends on us, on what we know, on what we remember, on whether we can, in the time we have, become what we were designed to become. The scribes who pressed these words into wet clay knew something about urgency. They wrote as if it mattered whether the record survived, as if the transmission was not merely a cultural exercise, but a preparation, a message sent across the millennia to a generation that would finally have the tools to understand what was being said. We are that generation, and the clay tablets are still speaking. The mystery schools, keepers of the forbidden flame. There is a thread that runs unbroken from the moment the Watchers descended on Mount Hermon and transmitted their forbidden knowledge to the Nephilim generation through every major civilization that followed to the present day. It is not a visible thread. It was never meant to be visible. The knowledge it carries was dangerous in the hands of those who controlled human development, and the people who preserved it understood that visibility meant destruction, that the only way to maintain the transmission across the catastrophes that Enlil's management of humanity periodically imposed was to hide it, encode it, wrap it in symbol and ritual and the language of religion so that it could travel through time in plain sight, disguised as something other than what it was. We call these preservation systems the mystery schools, and the first thing to understand about them is that the word mystery does not mean what we think it means. In the ancient Greek tradition from which we take the term, the word mysterion did not mean something unknown or unknowable. It meant something hidden, something deliberately concealed, something that was known to those who had been initiated into its knowledge, but that was, for very specific and practical reasons, not shared openly with the uninitiated. The Eleusinian mysteries were not mysterious in the sense of being vague or metaphorical. They were mysterious in the sense of being secret, and what they were keeping secret across more than 2,000 years of continuous operation in ancient Greece was something specific, something that could be taught and transmitted and understood, something that the initiated described consistently as the most important knowledge a human being could possess. What was it? The ancient sources are tantalizing precisely because they honor the oath of secrecy that all initiates took, but they give us enough to work with. Cicero, who was initiated at Eleusis, wrote that the mysteries gave him not merely a reason to live well, but a reason to die with equanimity, an understanding of the nature of the soul and its relationship to the divine that transformed his experience of existence. Pindar wrote of those who had seen the mysteries that they knew the end of life and the God-given beginning. Plato, whose philosophical system is saturated with the concepts and vocabulary of the mystery tradition, described the final revelation of the mysteries as a direct apprehension of ultimate reality, a seeing rather than a learning, an experience that could not be transmitted through ordinary language, but only through the specific initiatory process the mysteries had developed over centuries. Modern scholarship has focused considerable attention on the question of what the Eleusinian initiates actually experienced, and a compelling body of evidence, assembled primarily by the classicist Karl Ruck and the ethnobotanist R. Gordon Wasson, and later extended by researchers including Brian Murarescu, suggests that the climactic experience of the mysteries involved the consumption of a psychoactive preparation, the kykeon, a ritual drink whose ingredients included ergot-infected barley, the natural source of the chemical compounds from which LSD was synthesized in the 20th century. This is not speculation. It is supported by chemical analysis of residues found in vessels associated with mystery cult sites across the ancient Mediterranean, by ancient textual descriptions of the kykeon's effects, and by the extraordinary consistency of what ancient initiates described experiencing, a direct perception of the unity of all things, a dissolution of the ordinary boundaries of self, a vision of reality at a level of depth and coherence that ordinary consciousness does not access. But we need to go further than the pharmacological question, because the psychoactive component of the mysteries, while real and significant, was not the content of what was being transmitted. It was the method of transmission, the technology used to open the doors of perception wide enough for the actual content to enter. The content was the knowledge, the cosmological understanding, the historical truth about human origins and human potential, the memory of where we came from and what we were built to become. The mysteries were not simply a transcendent drug experience. They were a structured initiatory curriculum that used the altered state as a vehicle for delivering specific content about the nature of reality, the nature of the human soul, and the relationship between human consciousness and the divine intelligence that the Anunnaki represented in its most evolved form. The Eleusinian mysteries were only the most famous of what was, in the ancient world, a vast network of interconnected initiatory traditions operating simultaneously across multiple cultures. The Orphic tradition, which predated the Eleusinian mysteries and was one of its sources, preserved in its gold tablets the thin sheets of inscribed gold placed in the graves of initiates from southern Italy to Macedonia, a set of instructions for the soul after death that describe a cosmological journey remarkably consistent with what we have been reconstructing from the Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The soul, the Orphic tablets instruct, must remember its divine origin, must not drink from the spring of forgetting, must identify itself to the guardians of the underworld as a child of both earth and starry heaven, must claim its divine inheritance against the forces that would reduce it to an ordinary human fate. This is not poetic metaphor. When you read the Orphic tablets in the context of the Anunnaki narrative, you see immediately what they are describing. The soul that descends into incarnation carries the divine genetic and spiritual heritage of its Anunnaki origins, but that heritage is obscured by the ordinary conditions of human existence, by the forgetting that Enlil's management system was designed to enforce. The mystery traditions existed precisely to counteract that forgetting, to restore to the initiated the memory of their true origin and their true potential, to activate in living human beings something of the divine inheritance that had been encoded into the human genome by Enki, and that the Watchers had begun to transmit as external knowledge before they were imprisoned. The Egyptian tradition of initiation, the oldest and in many respects the most complete of the ancient mystery systems, makes this connection explicit. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately translated as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is not primarily a funeral text, though it served that function. It is an initiatory manual, a guide to a specific transformation of consciousness that the Egyptians understood as available to the living as well as the dead. The process it describes, the journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, is a journey through layers of consciousness, through the resistance of forces that seek to prevent the soul from claiming its divine nature, toward a final confrontation in the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the initiate is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and cosmic order. What is the heart being weighed against? What is the standard by which the initiate is judged? Not moral purity in the simple sense of having followed a set of rules. The negative confession, the list of 42 declarations that the initiate makes in the Hall of Two Truths, saying, I have not done this, I have not done that, is a statement of alignment with Ma'at, with the cosmic order, with the fundamental principles of justice and truth and reciprocity that in the Egyptian understanding governed the universe at its deepest level. The heart that is aligned with Ma'at, that has not weighed itself down with the distortions of selfishness and cruelty and deception, is the heart that is light enough to balance against the feather. The heart that has not achieved that alignment is devoured by the Amit, the composite beast that waits below the scales, and the soul undergoes a second death. In the Anunnaki framework, the Hall of Two Truths is the divine assembly. The Tablet of Destinies is the standard against which the human soul is measured. The question being asked is not, were you good, in a simple moralistic sense. The question being asked is, did you use what you were given? Did you develop the divine inheritance that was encoded into your biology and your consciousness? Did you become more fully what you were designed to become? Or did you remain, willingly or by default, within the managed parameters of Enlil's design, accepting the limitations of the tool when you were made, by the deepest intention of your most devoted maker, to be infinitely more? The Egyptian initiatory tradition claimed to have derived its knowledge directly from Thoth, and through Thoth from the first time, the period of divine presence on earth. The texts associated with Thoth, which in the later Greco-Egyptian tradition were collected under the name Hermetica, after Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes, the Greek identification of Thoth, represent one of the most complete surviving records of the knowledge that was transmitted in the mystery traditions. The Hermetic texts address directly the question of human nature, human origin, and human destiny, and what they say, when read carefully, is not mystical vagueness. It is a specific cosmological and anthropological position that integrates perfectly with the Anunnaki narrative. The most important of the Hermetic texts, the Poimandres, describes a vision in which the divine mind reveals to Hermes the truth of human creation. Humanity, the text says, was created by the demiurge, the craftsman god who is not the highest divine principle, but an intermediate creator working with existing material in a form that combines divine intelligence with physical nature. The divine human, the original human being in the Hermetic vision, was magnificent, a being of pure light and mind, reflecting the image of the divine creator, moving freely through all the spheres of the cosmos. But in descending into physical incarnation, in clothing itself in the matter of the lower world, the divine human forgot its own nature. It became identified with its physical form, mistook the prison for the self, and lost the memory of what it actually was. The Hermetic tradition exists, in its own understanding, precisely to reverse this process. Gnosis, the direct knowledge of the divine that the mystery traditions transmitted, was the medicine for the forgetting, not belief, not faith, not the acceptance of doctrines on the authority of a religious institution. Direct knowledge, experiential understanding, the same kind of knowing that the mystery initiates described coming through the initiatory process, that Plato described as the final revelation of the mysteries, that the Orphic tablets were trying to preserve for the soul after death. The Hermetic formula was, as above, so below, and it was not a vague statement of cosmic sympathy. It was a precise assertion. The structure of the cosmos is mirrored in the structure of the human being. To know yourself, truly and completely, is to know the cosmos, and to know the cosmos is to recover the memory of what you are. The suppression. Who benefits from the forgetting? If the mystery traditions were transmitting genuine knowledge about human origins and human potential, the question of why that knowledge was suppressed, why it was never simply taught openly and universally, why the majority of humanity has lived and died in the millennia since the Anunnaki's direct presence on Earth without access to the understanding that the mystery schools preserved, is a question that demands a direct and honest answer. Because the suppression was not accidental. It was not the simple result of ignorance, of knowledge being lost to the passage of time. The evidence, historical and textual, points to a deliberate, organized, sustained effort to prevent the transmission of this knowledge from reaching the general population of humanity. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is the most famous single event in this history of suppression, and the fact that it is so famous has perhaps allowed it to obscure the larger pattern of which it was only one episode. The library was not destroyed once in a single catastrophic fire. It was damaged and diminished over a period of centuries through multiple incidents, through the deterioration of institutional support, through the active hostility of religious and political authorities who correctly understood that the texts it preserved represented a comprehensive alternative to the managed cosmological frameworks through which human behavior was being organized and controlled. The manuscripts that survived, the fragments of Hermetic texts, the Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, containing Gnostic Gospels and philosophical texts that had been buried in the 4th century CE by monks trying to preserve them from destruction. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, containing texts that were deliberately excluded from the canonical Bible. All of these represent the survivors of a systematic program of elimination. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, at which the canonical texts of Christianity were officially determined, was not a theological seminar in which scholars dispassionately evaluated which texts best represented the teachings of Jesus. It was a political event at which the Roman Emperor Constantine, who had adopted Christianity as the imperial religion for very practical political reasons, presided over the determination of which version of Christian cosmology would be endorsed by the state and which versions would be declared heretical. The versions that were eliminated, the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the texts that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine over institutional mediation, that described Jesus as a teacher of gnosis rather than a sacrificial divine being, that contained cosmological frameworks that integrated with the older mystery traditions, were declared heretical not because they were theologically incoherent, but because they were politically inconvenient. A Christianity that taught humans to seek direct knowledge of their own divine nature without the mediation of a priestly hierarchy was a Christianity that could not be used to organize and control a population. A Christianity that taught dependence on institutional salvation, on the authority of bishops and councils, and ultimately of Rome, was an instrument of governance. The pattern repeats across every major religious and political transition in the history of the last 2,000 years. When the Islamic conquest spread across the Middle East and North Africa, the libraries and learning centers of the Hellenistic world that had preserved and continued the mystery traditions were disrupted or destroyed. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mesoamerica, they systematically burned the codices of the Maya and the Aztec. Thousands of books of astronomical, mathematical, historical, and cosmological knowledge accumulated over centuries because they recognized correctly that the knowledge in those books supported a cosmological framework that was incompatible with the managed religious system they were imposing. The Mayan priests who understood the long count calendar and its implications were killed or suppressed. The knowledge survived only in fragments, in what could be memorized and transmitted orally, in the astronomical alignments built into the stone monuments that were too massive to destroy. The Inquisition, which operated in Europe from the 13th to the 19th century, targeted not random criminals, but specifically those who were in possession of, or were transmitting, knowledge systems that challenged the cosmological authority of the Church. The witch trials of Europe and colonial America, whatever their complex sociological and psychological dimensions, were effective in eliminating or driving underground the remnants of pre-Christian knowledge systems that preserved, in fragmentary and often distorted form, aspects of the old transmission. The systematic persecution of Jewish mystical traditions, particularly the Kabbalistic lineages that preserved in their complex symbol system a detailed cosmological framework that integrated perfectly with the Anunnaki narrative, was not random anti-Semitism. Though it used anti-Semitism as its tool, it was targeted suppression of a knowledge tradition. Who benefits from the forgetting? The same entity that has always benefited from it. The management system. Whether we understand that system as the institutional legacy of Enlil's design for humanity, as the political and religious structures through which human development has been directed and constrained throughout recorded history, or as something more literally extraterrestrial and ongoing is, in one sense, less important than the functional observation that the suppression has been consistent, has been organized, and has served a consistent purpose: the prevention of humanity's full self-understanding. A humanity that does not know what it is cannot claim what it is owed. A humanity that believes its highest potential is determined by the religious or political authorities that manage it will not seek to exceed those parameters. The forgetting is not a tragedy that happened to humanity. It is a policy that was imposed on humanity, and it has been enforced with extraordinary thoroughness across an extraordinary span of time. But it did not fully succeed. The thread was not cut. It was hidden, encoded, buried in the foundations of traditions that survived precisely because they disguised their deepest content in the language of whatever the dominant culture of their time required. The Kabbalists transmitted the cosmological framework of the mystery schools in the language of Jewish Torah commentary. The alchemists transmitted the understanding of human transformation in the language of metallurgical experiment. The Freemasons preserved the architectural metaphors of the Egyptian initiatory tradition in the language of a stonemason's guild. The Rosicrucians transmitted the Hermetic gnosis in the language of Christian mysticism. None of these disguises were perfect. All of them were partial distortions of what they preserved, but all of them kept the flame alive when every open expression of it was being systematically extinguished. And in the modern period, the fire has emerged again, blinking from the hiding places where it has spent millennia in concealment. Not in the traditional religious institutions, which remain for the most part what they were designed to be: management systems. Not in the academic establishments, which have their own structural reasons for refusing to seriously engage with the implications of the ancient texts, but in the margins. In the researchers who have spent careers examining the anomalies that the standard frameworks cannot explain. In the people who have read the Sumerian tablets not as mythology, but as history. In the scientists who have looked at the human genome and asked the questions that their data is actually raising, rather than the questions their institutions are comfortable with. In the growing number of human beings who feel, with an urgency they cannot entirely explain, that something is being remembered, that something long suppressed is pushing up through the managed surface of the acceptable, like a seed that is waited in the dark for conditions that might finally allow it to grow. The convergence, what is happening right now? We need to talk about the present, because everything we have covered, the ancient war, the Anunnaki arrival, the creation of humanity, the suppression of the transmission, the mystery schools, and their long effort to preserve the forbidden knowledge across the catastrophes of managed history, all of it converges on the moment we are currently living through. And the convergence is not coincidental. It is, if the ancient texts are right, precisely what the cycles predicted. We are in the closing of the Great Age. We are at the moment that every prophetic tradition, from the Vedic to the Mayan to the Norse to the Hebrew to the Egyptian, identified as the point of maximum crisis and maximum possibility, the point at which the long suppression either succeeds permanently or fails catastrophically, the point at which humanity either remembers what it is or forgets forever. Consider what is happening simultaneously right now in the late years of the second decade of the 21st century. In genetics, the development of CRISPR-Cas9 and related gene editing technologies has given humanity, for the first time, the practical ability to deliberately modify the human genome. We are, within the span of living memory, going to face the question of what we want our species to be at the most fundamental biological level. That is exactly the question that the Anunnaki faced when they created us. We are not merely their creation confronting that question abstractly. We are beings with the actual tool in our hands. In astronomy and space science, the detection of thousands of exoplanets, including many in potentially habitable zones, has transformed the question of whether life exists elsewhere in the universe from a philosophical speculation to a statistical near certainty. The recent Pentagon acknowledgments of UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena that display flight characteristics inconsistent with any known human technology, have moved the question of non-human intelligence from the fringe to the center of official government discussion in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and multiple other nations. In archaeology, the ongoing excavation of Göbekli Tepe and related sites in southeastern Turkey is systematically dismantling the standard chronology of human civilization, pushing the evidence of organized, architecturally sophisticated human activity back to a period that the standard model cannot accommodate. New underwater archaeological discoveries off the coasts of India, Japan, Cuba, and elsewhere are raising the possibility that the global sea level rise of the post-glacial period, which was massive and rapid by geological standards, submerged a significant portion of the coastline-dwelling population of the pre-flood world, and with it a significant portion of the physical evidence of whatever civilization existed in that period. In consciousness research, the growing scientific legitimacy of psychedelic research, the clinical studies at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College London demonstrating that psilocybin and related compounds reliably produce the kind of transformative mystical experience that the ancient mystery schools built their entire initiatory program around, suggests that the tool the ancient initiates used to open the doors of perception was not superstition. It was chemistry, and it works. Each of these developments, taken alone, is remarkable. Taken together, they constitute a convergence, a simultaneous awakening across multiple domains of human inquiry, each one pulling back a different layer of the managed forgetting, each one approaching from a different direction, the suppressed knowledge that the mystery schools spent millennia trying to preserve. We are, in the language of the ancient texts, at the cusp. We are at the moment that the cycles were always building toward. The Vedic tradition calls it the end of the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, and the transition into the Dvapara, or even Satya Yuga, the ages of increasing light and truth. The duration of the Kali Yuga in the traditional Vedic reckoning is 432,000 years, a number that appears with striking frequency across multiple ancient astronomical traditions, and which connects to the orbital and precessional cycles that structured the Anunnaki's relationship to Earth. The Mayan long count, completing its current great cycle, marked not an ending but a transformation, the close of a Baktun, a period of approximately 400 years, nested within larger and larger cycles of cosmic time, each one marking a different phase of the great unfolding that the Mayan astronomical tradition mapped with extraordinary precision. The Hebrew Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the end of the current cosmic week, the 6 days of creation, and the approach of the cosmic Sabbath, the seventh day of rest, in which the created world returns to its creator and is transformed. The Norse tradition offers the most vivid image of the transition. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, is not simply the destruction of the world, it is the end of a specific world, the world organized around the authority of the Aesir, the divine beings who had managed human history from their seat at Asgard. In the aftermath of Ragnarok, when the old gods have fought their final battles and the world has gone through the fire and the flood, a new earth rises from the waters, green and fertile, renewed. And in that new world, the surviving gods, those who had not been consumed in the final battle, sit together and remember. They remember the old world. They remember what was lost and what was preserved. And they find, in the grass, the golden game pieces with which the gods had played their games of fate in the old world, preserved through the destruction, waiting to be taken up again in a new game with new rules. The golden game pieces, the tablets of destiny, the fundamental mechanisms through which the order of reality is determined. After the destruction of the old order, they are still there. They are not destroyed. They are not in anyone's possession. They are lying in the grass, waiting for whoever comes after to decide what to do with them. The choice, what we do with what we know. We have come a long way from the wet clay tablets and the urgent hands that pressed them. We have traveled from the cosmological war that preceded Earth's formation to the genetic engineering of the human species, from the mystery schools that preserved the forbidden knowledge through 2,000 years of suppression to the contemporary convergence of discoveries that is pulling back the curtain on what was hidden. And we have arrived, as all of this was always going to arrive, at a question, not a rhetorical question, not a question whose answer is already determined and to which we need only nod in agreement. A real question whose answer is genuinely open, genuinely uncertain, genuinely consequential. The question is this: what do we do with what we know? Because the ancient narrative, if it is true, changes everything about how we understand ourselves. It changes the meaning of the word human. It changes the question of what we owe each other and what we are owed by whatever forces have shaped our development. It changes the framework within which we evaluate the institutions and systems that organize our collective life, the political, economic, and religious structures through which human energy and human potential are currently being directed. If we are what the ancient texts say we are, if we are a hybrid species carrying the genetic and spiritual legacy of a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, a legacy that has been deliberately suppressed for millennia by forces whose interest was our manageability rather than our flourishing, then the management systems are not simply flawed institutions that need reform. They are the continuation of a war that was fought over our heads before our first ancestor was born, and our relationship to them must be reconsidered from the ground up. This is not a call to any kind of violence or destructive action. The ancient texts, and particularly the tradition associated with Enki, are very clear about this. The resolution of the cosmic war, the final chapter that the prophetic traditions point toward, does not come through the replication of the war's violence at the human level. It comes through something much more radical and much more difficult than violence. It comes through knowing. Enki's weapon against Enlil was never force. Enki was never the stronger military power. Enki's weapon was knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that, once possessed, cannot be unpossessed. The knowledge of what we are, the knowledge of what we carry, the knowledge that the divine inheritance encoded in our cells is not a metaphor, not a theological consolation, not a comforting story about being made in the image of God. It is a biological and spiritual reality whose full expression is the one outcome that the management system has never been able to afford. The mystery schools understood this. Their entire project was the transmission of that knowledge to enough human beings in enough generations that the thread could not be cut. They did not expect to transform civilization in a single generation, or 10, or 100. They were playing a long game because they understood the stakes and they understood the timescale on which the relevant cycles operated. What they were trying to do across all of their different cultural forms and historical periods was ensure that when the moment of maximum possibility arrived, when the cycles converged and the managed forgetting began to crack under the pressure of its own accumulated contradictions, there would be enough human beings who remembered, or who were capable of remembering, to make a difference. We may be those human beings, not because we are special in the sense of being selected or chosen or superior to others, but because we are alive at this particular convergence, because we have access to the ancient texts and the modern science and the archaeological discoveries and the genetic data and the philosophical traditions that make it possible, for the first time in the history of the current cycle, to reconstruct the full picture, to see the whole story, to understand not just fragments of the transmission, but the transmission itself, the complete message that was pressed into clay in ancient Sumer by hands that moved with urgency because they understood that what they were recording might be the most important thing that any human being had ever written down. What do we do with it? We remember, we think, we share. We refuse the managed forgetting. We look at the institutions that organize our lives and ask, with the full weight of what we now understand, whose purposes do these actually serve? We look at the cosmological frameworks that tell us what is real and what is possible, and ask, with the rigor of people who have examined the evidence, where did these frameworks actually come from, and who benefits from the limitations they impose? We look at the capabilities we have developed, particularly the technological capabilities of the current period, the genetic engineering tools, the artificial intelligence systems, the space travel capabilities that are bringing the solar system within reach for the first time in the current human cycle. And we ask, are these being developed in alignment with Enlil's design as tools of control and extraction, or in alignment with Enki's vision as the expressions of a species finally coming into its own? The answer, in the present moment, is both. We are at the exact crux, the exact point of maximum uncertainty. The technologies that could liberate us are the same technologies that could be used to create a surveillance and control architecture of unprecedented comprehensiveness. The genetic engineering that could express the full divine inheritance is the same genetic engineering that could be used to create a managed humanity of even greater precision than anything Enlil imagined. The artificial intelligence that could amplify human wisdom and accelerate the development of human potential is the same artificial intelligence that could replace human decision-making with optimized management systems that serve the interests of whoever controls the optimization parameters. The ancient war is not over. It has simply found new instruments. Epilogue, the message in the clay. Let us return, at the end, to where we began, to the scribes, to the wet clay and the urgent hands and the reed stylus pressing wedge-shaped marks into a surface that would, against all probability, survive for 6,000 years and arrive here in the hands of a species that is finally developing the vocabulary to understand what it contains. Why did they write it down? Not because it was their job, though it was. Not because they were told to, though they may have been. They wrote it down with urgency, and the urgency is palpable across 6,000 years in the very quality of the texts, in their insistence on detail, in their repetition of the crucial elements across multiple versions and multiple traditions, as if the scribes knew that not every copy would survive, and they needed redundancy, needed the message to arrive from multiple directions. They wrote it down because they understood something that we are only now beginning to re-understand, that the knowledge of what we are is the most dangerous and the most necessary thing we can possess. Dangerous because those who have organized human society around the premise of our limitation have always found that knowledge threatening. Necessary because without it, we cannot become what we were built to become. We cannot make the choices that the convergence of this moment is demanding that we make. We cannot navigate what is coming with the wisdom that it requires. The clay tablets are not a relic of a primitive past. They are a message from a future that the ancient scribes could see from where they stood, a future that is now, unmistakably, our present. They are the opening of a conversation that has been waiting, patient as stone, for us to be ready to have it. Not just to read the words, not just to interpret the mythology, but to understand what is actually being said. What is being said is this: you were made for more than you have been allowed to be. The war that created you is not over. The forces that want to keep you manageable are still active, still organized, still using every tool available to prevent the moment of your full awakening. But the design that was built into you by the one who loved you enough to defy the entire hierarchy to preserve your potential, that design is also still active. It is in your cells. It is in your capacity for consciousness and wonder and love, and the kind of truth-seeking that will not be satisfied with comfortable answers. It is in the fact that you are here, now, asking the questions that the management system has always tried to prevent you from asking. The tablets were pressed in urgency. The urgency was not about the past. It was about this moment, about whether, when the convergence finally arrived, the message would have survived long enough to be received. It has. You are receiving it now. The question the ancient scribes were trying to reach across 6,000 years to ask you is not, do you believe this? It is, what are you going to do? The golden pieces are in the grass. The game is not over. The next move is ours. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.